planks at muscles or underneath. Where it says zero, transportation here, manager there.
See? There you go.
She handles all our land use planning. Has been here since like 20 years.
And I know she started
Yes. Yep. Right.
Oh, great. Mayor.
I know he was down in Lacamas, seeing that picture in Olympia, so, and that was, he was coming back today, I don't know if he's gonna make it back in time, he's been also away from his family for a couple of days, so. Same time, I wouldn't be surprised to see him walk into his wife.
Hi, everybody. My name is Robert Ball. I'm the planning manager of the city of Camas. Thank you all for coming tonight. This is a great presentation, and we're very fortunate to have some guests here with us with the Department of Commerce. I'm going to actually just hand it right over to Ann Fritzel and let her take it away, and yeah, we'll have plenty of opportunity for questions after.
Thank you, Robert, and welcome. Welcome to the short course on local planning, always free and open to all. It's presented in Washington communities since 1977. For more than 40 years, we've been coming to communities and providing basic information about planning. And we're so glad to be here, and we're so glad you were here. My name is Ann Fritzel. I'm a senior planner at the Department of Commerce in Olympia in the Growth Management Unit. We help cities to implement the Growth Management Act, to understand the substantive and procedural aspects of the Growth Management Act. I want to point out to our partners. We have 4 partners that help us with the short course. We have the Washington Cities Insurance Authority and AWC's Risk Management Agency, and those are cities' insurance schools. And they provide funding to us because land use is such a big source of risk that they want to make sure that this course is provided and available to the community. Our other partners are the American Planning Association, the Washington chapter. These are professional planners, and it's an organization that stay up to date and certified. And the Planning Association of Washington, which really started the course in 1963, and they still are partners and focus on the education for planning officials and planning commissioners. So we want to thank the City of Camas for inviting us here. We're pleased to hear and thank our speakers. We have 2 volunteer speakers, Jim McNamara right here, who's an attorney for the City of Longview, and Jennifer Davis in the back. She's a planning manager for Thurston County and a former planning commissioner. And they're both here not representing their organizations. They're here as volunteers because they want to support this educational effort. You have the agenda packet that you either printed out, or good job, or picked up at the back. It has the agenda in the front. You'll see that there's 4 sections. We're going to start out with the basics of this complicated patchwork of land use laws that we have. And then I'm going to cover information about the Growth Management Act and the framework for how we plan in the state. After a short break, we'll have Jennifer talk about the rules in planning, who does what, and how we work effectively together. And then we'll finish off with the Open Public Meetings Act and public records component, and we have a certificate review for that. That's required for elected officials and planning commissioners within 90 days of being appointed or elected. We have a little booklet that you also got, and that's the majority of our handouts for tonight. It's something you can read quickly to know the basics, know where to get more information, and hand it to somebody on your board or committee that wasn't able to come tonight so that they know the pieces as well. And if you really are really digging it and you want more, we have a much larger version. This is on our website. It's something you can download. It's a little bit behind, but it still has all the basics with much more information. And if reading's not your thing, we have a whole YouTube series of this planning information. You can go to Popcorn and binge watch our entire 9-minute series in one night, and then you can download the certificate. So if your friends couldn't come, they can do it online as well. We also have some special course videos as well. The printouts, if you want a copy, we put them on our short course webpage so you can go to the box and download them for your course. We have a sign-in sheet at the back that we hope you'll sign in so we can track how many people here, and also our record that you were here if your city gets credit for you taking this training. So I encourage you to sign in. It's also a chance to sign up for information from our sponsors, the Planning Association and APA. I'd like to go around the room just so we can find out who's here. So just your name and who you're with. So, Ann Fritzel, Department of Commerce. Sarah Dollars, Legal Center. Liz Cervini, County, City of Lucerne.
Matt Jenkins, City of Lucerne.
Dennis Hill, City of Center.
Steve Workman, City of Lucerne.
Warren Montgomery, City of Camas.
Marcel Ishke, Planning Commissioner, City of Camas.
Laura Hogan, Clark County. Judith Lawrence, City of Camas.
Mike Salas, Clark County.
Robert Mall, City of Camas.
Lauren Hollenbeck, City of Camas.
Madeline Sutherland, City of Camas. Great, thank you. Down there.
George Capaci, just a citizen of Washoe.
Matt Little, unincorporated Fern Prairie.
Jeff Fishburne, unincorporated Clark County.
Susan Jordan, I live in Camas. Miss Karen, I live in Camas.
Jerry Urbano, I live in Camas. Diana McLean, City of Lucerne.
Brandy Livingston, I live in Camas.
Shannon Roberts, Camas City Council.
Greg Thornton, Center City Council.
Jay Chester, Clark County.
David Regan, Vancouver, Washington. Bill Williams, Camas Parks and Recreation Commission.
Scott Hall, Board of Adjustment, City of Camas.
Bill Berkman, Community Development Director, City of Camas.
Ed Fisher, citizen of Camas.
Brent Smithline, citizen of Camas, and Washington District 4 Little League Baseball.
Ingrid Friedberg, Olson Engineering.
Tay, City of Vancouver.
Ethan Spoo, City of Lucerne.
Jamie Moore, resident, City of Camas.
Robert DeZero, student at Camas High School.
Sheila Schmidt, City of Camas.
Sean High, City of Camas.
Deanna Holland, Lilbeth, City Council.
Two more.
Jennifer Davis, Thurston County.
Sarah Fox, Senior Planner, City of Camas.
Great. Thank you for coming all this way on this dark night. We did this a year ago in January, or we tried to. It's the Snowmageddon week. So we rescheduled. We were here in April, but we're glad to be back. Sure.
Can I make a suggestion on this microphone? You cannot hold it away from you. You've got to talk. Make it right up here, or we don't hear you.
Okay. Does everybody hear me?
Yeah. Okay, that's the type of microphone it is. If you don't do that, and we just see lips moving up there.
Okay. Probably also out in the community as we're streaming this event live tonight.
Thank you.
So, I have some final words. We have a lot of material to cover. You may interrupt our speakers with brief clarifying questions, or you can ask more complicated at the end of each speaker's time, and we also have 30 minutes set at the end for all of your questions. Restrooms back there. Any questions, comments, suggestions before we go on?
Do you have any more of the bigger one like this?
I do not. Our first speaker is James McNamara. He's the city attorney. Oh, thank you, Robert. From the city of Longview. Prior to this, he was a member for the city of Longview. Before that, he was a member of the Western Washington Growth Management Hearings Board. Before that, he was assistant city attorney for the city of Vancouver. With Vancouver, he advised long-range planning services, development review services, and transportation departments. He also was the legal advisor to the Vancouver Planning Commission. He was a federal way deputy city attorney and the assistant city attorney for the city of Bremerton. He has a BA in environmental sciences from the University of Virginia and a master's degree in planning from Virginia Tech. And then he became an attorney from Oregon School of Law. Thank you, Jim. University of Washington. I was just amazed you had a planning degree and a law degree.
here.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. As I like to tell people, I am an attorney, but I'm not your attorney, because everybody following me down here from Longview. So, as always, you know, if you're on the planning commission, if you're on the city council, elected or appointed officials or staff, if you have a question, talk to your city attorney. You know, if you go to your city attorney, they'll say, well, I was at this conference and we've got this issue that's coming from the planning commission, and I think it might be, we're asking too much, and it's probably a takings, and this guy Jim McNamara said this, and your city attorney will go, who? This guy, he's from Longview, and they'll say, well, we're in Camas now, Dorothy. So anyway, always, I want to give you the broad overview of the first piece of this presentation is, the constitutional basis of planning, and get into some of the issues that you may see as planning commissioners and city council members, or encounter as citizens or staff dealing with land use issues. But always, there's a lot more detail. Everything is fact specific. And what I can tell you tonight is not going to answer your questions when you get to having a proposal for you as members of the planning commission. Just so I can get a general idea of who's with what. How many planning commissioners do we have? Show of hands. Okay, and how many city council members and staff? And everybody else, interested citizens? Okay. All right, you good. Okay, well that just helps me understand. I mean, typically we get that kind of mix of a crowd. So, I'm going to move this so I can see what you see. So what we're going to talk about is, well, actually, Ann mentioned that I went to planning school, Virginia Tech, under the Fighting Gophers, and as an internship between first and second year of planning school, I was an intern for Roanoke County, Virginia planning department, and we did this big presentation. We updated a comprehensive plan, and we presented it to the planning commission. And one of the planning commissioners looked at me and said, what gives you, the county, the right to tell people what to do with their land? And I was a little taken aback, because this guy's on the planning commission. I figured he'd sort of, bought into the idea of planning. It's a good thing. But it makes you realize not everybody buys into the fact that we have the right to tell people what to do with their land. And that's really where we come from. Where does that power come from? And I'm not going to go into a whole history of the legal basis of planning and give that big overview, but at the bottom it's come from what we call the police power, which is the power of the government to regulate, to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. That's what we call the police power. So that's where zoning originally originated from. Zoning wasn't because people thought, well, we should separate necessarily high-density industrial from low-density industrial. It was more like we need setbacks so that the fire department can get between buildings. That's where those kind of standards come from. We need to separate the pig farms from the industrial zones or from the residential zones to protect property values, to protect health, so we have clean air. That's where the authority of the zone came from, to protect public health and protect property values. So it's all from this police power, which comes from the federal government's constitutional power to regulate. Federal government, the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of land, and therefore every power that you exercise, even down at the local level, as a city council member or planning commissioner, has to derive from the authority granted by federal law under the Constitution delegated to the states. So anyway, as I was saying, we've got this power of the government to really control your property, your heights of the buildings, setbacks between the buildings, whole host of things that people often find a little hard to swallow at times. And we have this tension between two really sort of forces that you will see in front of you at the planning commission. When people come forward proposing a development, and the other side of the room is there opposing the development, and that is this countervailing forces between property rights on one hand and the need to regulate to protect the public health and safety on one hand. So this quote from our famous Norco versus King County case way back in the 80s, the basic rule of land use is that absent more, an individual should be able to utilize his land as he sees fit. That's fairly broad, okay? Absent more, though, is the details where we come in as the government. I say we because I'm a municipal attorney. We tell the landowner what he can do with his property. And if you've ever looked at your local development code, you know, there's a lot we tell people, or the RCWs for, you know, subdivisions or anything of that nature. So on one hand, we have this idea about property rights, which are held near and dear to every property owner. And on the other hand, we have this other force, which is the limits on that. Okay, so the government has all this authority, and then on the other hand, we have these limits on what we can do as government officials in order to regulate property. What you can require as a staff member, what you can require or impose or suggest to the city council to impose as a planning commissioner, or actually impose as a development commission as a city council member. And in order to do that, you have to go through really what everybody's entitled to process. So I want to talk about two types of process which people are, property owners and the public, are constitutionally entitled to have. So we talk about procedural due process and substantive due process. And it all sounds fairly dry, but it really is the nuts and bolts of what you end up doing as staff and planning commission members and city council members, and what you as members of the public are entitled to, or if you're a property owner who wants to push your project through, or if you're an opponent of a project that you want to see be involved in the process. So procedural due process is just how we go about the process. Things like notice and opportunity to be heard. So if you're a property owner and there's a development in your community, you have the right to notice of that. That's what we call procedural due process. Your development code will say something in various community that for this type of development, everyone within 203 feet, 500 feet, or whatever, has to get notice of this application. That's due process. If you're a member of the community and you're within that circle and you didn't get notice, you know, you're going to hire an attorney, you're going to go to court, you're going to say, this approval should be, you know, stricken because they violated my rights as a citizen to procedural due process. I didn't get notice, therefore I didn't show up to the planning commission or city council and have my opportunity to speak in favor or against this proposal. So that's what we call procedural due process, and it's really important because everybody, the developer as well as the opponents of the development, has the right to have a fair, predictable hearing, right? So we have these standards that we adopt so that everybody knows what happens and what's supposed to happen in what time frame. And again, I say these things, they're not written in stone. For some aspects, you know, the notice is provided by state law, but on a local level, sometimes it's very up to the local jurisdiction. I used to be with the city of Vancouver, and there was this big push to expand the notice, you know, that you would give for a particular project. And then when you start looking at the details, it's like, well, postage increases exponentially as the size of that circle increases. So there has to be some sort of balance. You know, how much notice do you give? Do you give notice to everybody in the community? Well, no, that's impractical and expensive, and so typically you have to decide what's adequate due process. So when the courts are looking at this, and I don't want to get too deeply into this, but they're going to look at, in terms of whether we provided procedural due process, what's the private interest that we're trying to protect? What's the risks of erroneous decision if their procedures are deficient? And then what's the government's interest? So they'll balance those things. The other aspect of it, sort of the meat and potatoes of what we're doing, is what we call substantive due process. So the notice went out, the public's been notified, the developer has been given adequate notice and opportunity to proceed through the process. And then, so it's in front of the planning commission or city council, and there has staff recommendations of what conditions we're going to put on this proposal. So maybe it's a use that might have some sort of light and glare aspects of it. So how much shielding should we do? What should be the vegetative setback in this proposal? So these are sort of things that, what conditions are we imposing on this development? That's what we call, substantive due process. Are we the substance, really, of what we're imposing on a procedure, on a proposal? And so, really, we have to look at what are we trying to achieve. If we're going to impose, a glare requirement or a setback requirement or a height, a shielding requirement for shrubbery and things of that nature, What is going to be the height, and what's the basis for that? Is it purely aesthetic, or does it go to protect the neighboring community from light and glare, things like that? So the courts will look at, does the regulation seek to achieve a legitimate public purpose? And it hasn't always been the case that zoning was considered a legitimate public purpose, but that battle has been won many years ago, and that's a legitimate public purpose, zoning. So looking at a particular development, and we'll be looking at perhaps the actual regulations that we're trying to adopt, those might be challenged, or we might be looking at a project-specific thing where the staff has proposed certain conditions of approval, and the planning commission or city council is considering whether to propose those conditions of approval. So the courts will look at, are the means used reasonably necessary to the stated objective? And it's usually a good idea, but it's not always a great idea to necessarily follow staff's recommendations. I mean, you ought to trust your professional planners, but your job as planning commissioners and city council members is also to ask that question. What are we trying to achieve? Are these conditions going to help us achieve that? Because you'll hear, people on both sides of the aisle, objecting or supporting the conditions. These conditions are too onerous. The project won't pencil out. If I have to put this much, in green space, then we won't have enough, housing, and we won't be able to sell our units, and therefore we can't build the project. Versus you'll hear from the public, we need more park space, we need more amenities. So there's always that back and forth push. So your job as decision makers or members of the public who are advocating pro and con are to make the case whether these conditions are in fact reasonably necessary to achieve that objective, whatever that objective is. Protection of the public safety, by separation of inappropriate, incompatible uses. And then the other question, which is, a big subject of litigation, is the chosen regulation unduly burdensome on the landowner? And obviously, you're going to get difference of opinions on that, depending on who you talk to. And every developer will want to make sure that the project pencils out, and they want to make sure that they make a reasonable profit, which is, of course, important because otherwise projects won't be developed. On the other hand, members of the community might have a different perspective in terms of what conditions should be placed upon the project, and they may not be really thinking about the financial aspects of whether that places a burden on the developer or whether these conditions are impractical and then substantially reduce the number of units that can be constructed. So that is, again, a part of substantive due process. Are we depriving the property owner or the public of substantive due process in terms of the conditions we impose? Another aspect that you really need to be conscious of that is an aspect of substantive due process is what the courts will call void for vagueness. So you'll look at a code sometimes and it'll have, I wish I had a better example of language that might be in your development code. And I'll just make something up, the facade should be, a pleasing facade should be, applied to the outside of the duplexes. So what does that mean, void for vagueness? Well, a code standard, and as planning commissioners and city council members, you will be in charge of adopting or amending or recommending code changes, is you look at the standard that's going to be imposed. Does the public know what it means? Does the developer who's going to be implementing it know what it means? And often a regulation will be stricken because it's void for vagueness. So again, that's an aspect of substantive due process because someone to read that code section and apply it, whether they're the developer or they're an opponent of the development, or whether they're a citizen just trying to figure out what the code stands for, has to have a good idea of what we're actually requiring. Now, we try to adopt codes and standards that guide development in a way that reflects the desires of the community. That's why planning commissioners are appointed within the community. That's why city council members are elected from the community. And we all have different ideas about what conditions we want to impose on the development. The tension that also exists when we're putting these conditions upon a proposal that you have to be wary of is the constitutional prohibition against takings. The Fifth Amendment of the Constitution says that property shall not be taken without just compensation. So takings can be in various forms. There is what we call a categorical taking, where the property is invaded, right? If you were putting a road across somebody's property, you are certainly invading the property, right? You have to go through a process of condemnation to eminent domain and pay just compensation. Sometimes it's not such an obvious form of taking, and that's what we call regulatory takings. So the burdens of regulations that the development code or the proposed staff report or the city council puts these conditions on a proposal, keep on one after another, that the property owner then, in order to meet those conditions, really can't make the project fly, and he'll say, well, I'm deprived of any economically viable use of my property, then he's suffered a taking. So they'll go to court and they'll say, well, these conditions are overly oppressive and unduly burdensome, and the government, by imposing these conditions, has essentially taken my property, and they'll either ask, remove these conditions, or make the government pay me compensation for, depriving me of the value of my property. So again, on a day-to-day basis for planning commissioners and city council members and staff, that's just something that you need to keep in mind. It's frequently the case that a developer will come in and say, this is a taking. I mean, it's sort of like, you almost expect the first words that are out of their mouth to be that, because they're always trying to do, well, do we really need sidewalks? Nobody in this community walks. It's an over 55 community. No, I hear this all the time, right? It's like, we don't need more than one parking space per unit because this is an over 55 residential development. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm over 55, I drive, my wife drives, but that's the argument. So, I mean, it's always going to be the economic incentive, and I'm a little biased, pro-municipal government, not anti-development, but I hear the arguments from the developers, or I have, that, they're trying to make a profit. A bigger profit is better, so if they can reduce, separated sidewalks, maybe not put in curbs after all, because as I've been told, nobody walks anymore. That's where the push is going to be. And if you don't accede to it, then it's a taking. So, there's that push and shove that, maybe they'll appeal, maybe they won't, but they're going to make that try because not putting in curbs or using roll curbs instead of regular curbs is cheaper and reduces the cost of development. So anyway, those are the questions you need to ask, or your city attorney will argue regarding the conditions that are imposed on it. So the caution for you as planning commissioners or city council members is it has to be temporary, right? It's great to put conditions of approval on that you think will increase the appeal and the amenities of development, but you can only go so far, and if you go too far, then it's going to be what's considered a takings. Okay. That's a very short overlook of some of the aspects of procedural and substantive due process. I do want to talk briefly about some of the other statutes that you will encounter. I'm not going to talk about these statutes in particular, just to mention that they happen or that they occur. So there's various statutory regimes that you operate under, depending upon whether you're a county, whether you're a city, whether you're a first-class city or a code city, whether you're a county such as Clark County that operates under the Growth Management Act, or like me in Cowlitz County where we don't operate under the Growth Management Act because we weren't subject to it when it was adopted in 1990. But again, these are the big things that you need to be aware of. The Planning and Enabling Statutes, the Planning Commission Act, the Optional Municipal Code, I'm not sure whether Camas is under that code or not, the Planning and Enabling Act, and if you're a charter form of government, Act provision. Another provision that, another speaker will address here in just a moment, includes the Growth Management Act. And I'm just going to touch on this briefly because maybe she'll talk about some aspects that I won't. So the Growth Management Act is certainly an important aspect of planning in Clark County because Clark County is subject to the GMA. And just the big picture things, the Growth Management Act was adopted in 1990 as a result of rapid growth in the state of Washington and the desire to put some sort of limits on growth and to make it, protect agricultural land. A number of goals within the GMA, 13 goals, including the 14th goal, which is the Shorelines Management Plan and protection of shorelines. But the key aspects of the Growth Management Act would be to protect critical areas. agricultural lands, steep slopes, things of that nature. Conserve resource lands, designate urban growth areas, and make sure that infrastructure decisions match what's called concurrency requirement, which essentially means that your roads have to be there as development comes along. Your sewers have to be there to serve the development. And also another aspect of the Growth Management Act, another goal, is preventing sprawl, because that was seen as a threat, in the then and as well as now, with the rapid development in Clark County in particular, and throughout the state at that time, there was seen a need to protect this sprawling development, which increased transportation costs, et cetera. So really, the Growth Management Act talks about how you plan, it requires the adoption of a comprehensive plan, and it talks about certain things which your plan has to cover. Another aspect of, certainly here in Camas, I've got a late in the right behind me, is the Shoreline Management Act, which any city with a shoreline has to abide by. Longview is fortunate in the sense that we are surrounded by a dike which was built in the 20s to protect the city of Longview from flooding. And so we don't really have many shorelines subject to the Shoreline Management Act. But anyway, the Shoreline Management Act governs shorelines and the shorelines. That's, I checked for myself. And basically provides an emphasis on preserving shorelines for shoreline-dependent uses, docks, public access, preserving visual access and visual corridors to the shorelines, and things of that nature. Accommodating reasonable uses. You're not prohibited from building a dock or hardening your shoreline to prevent erosion, but there are restrictions on what you can do. Shoreline appeals, we grant shoreline permit, development permit, are appealed to the Shoreline Hearings Board. The Shoreline Management Plan itself, if appealed, goes to the Growth Management Hearings Board. And we've seen a number of those appeals over the years. So anyway, your jurisdiction would be required to adopt a shoreline master program. Most cities originally adopted their program in 1970, and it's only in the last few years that most communities are getting around to updating their plans, though I think I heard that Camas has updated theirs several times, so ahead of the curve. We were just in Longview updating ours since it was adopted early in the 70s. So also there's a requirement to have a permitting program for shoreline substantial development permits and things of that nature. Another thing you will hear a lot of as your city council or the planning commission or members of the public is the State Environmental Policy Act. SEPA, as it's usually referred to, was originally modeled after, and a lot of states adopted after, the National Environmental Policy Act, adopted in the 70s nationally. But SEPA has a lot more substantive effect than NEPA. NEPA, for federal projects, requires analysis of development proposals and consideration of their environmental impacts. SEPA goes a lot farther, and SEPA has the ability to impose conditions on approval. So a project, if it has to be evaluated to determine whether it's going to have likely environmental impacts, and they're determined to be, the project is issued a DNS to determine it's not likely to have environmental impacts, or mitigated determination of significance, or if it does deem to have likely significant adverse environmental impacts, then there's the idea of imposing the need to review it under an environmental impact statement. So the first step is, looking at the nature of the proposal. Is SEPA even necessary? For example, construction of a single-family residence by itself, standalone, is likely to be SEPA exempt, your typical single-family residence. Determine who is the lead agency. That is, who is going to be the agency that reviews this project. Typically, it's the permitting agency. Evaluating the proposal and to determine whether it's a determination of significance, a determination of non-significance, or what we call, and which is the most common thing, a mitigated determination of non-significance, the MDNS slide behind us up here. In which case, the community has the ability to impose mitigation measures. And that's really where SEPA really differs from NEPA, for example. I mean, this is the idea is that we will be able to impose these conditions to protect the environment. So here's the proposal, the mitigation measure. Yes, it's going to have environmental impacts, how can those impacts be mitigated or lessened or protected against? And that is conditions, buffers, setbacks, things of that nature, shielding of light and glare, things of that nature. And that's really typically where the appeals come, and that's really where the public is involved mostly. It's like, yeah, we understand these mitigation measures. Here's some more that we think should be imposed upon the project. SEPA originally was the primary means of mitigating projects, the environmental impacts of projects. When GMA came along, jurisdictions were required to adopt a host of development regulations. Over time, the concept was that SEPA would just be the gap filler. So your GMA development regulations and the other regulations adopted under the Equipment Management Act would be the primary means of protecting the environment, and SEPA would be the things that GMA didn't really address. And that's still how it works today. So it's often referred to SEPA as being now as a gap filler. Though in jurisdictions that aren't subject to the GMA, SEPA would be the predominant means of protecting the environment. So again, as opposed to NEPA, this is the power the authorities, the regulatory authorities, council, staff, and planning commissions have to mitigate adverse environmental impacts is through SEPA and is through the mitigation process. Another regulatory system is the State Subdivision Act. Now, I'll catch up. Anyway. It's hard reading this at an angle. Subdivision Act. Okay, thanks. So in order to subdivide your property, many of you probably know this in my personal experience with it, you can't just, let's say you own 10 acres out in the county or in the city. You can't just divide your 10-acre parcel into 2 or more lots and sell them off individually. You have to go through the subdivision statute, and you have to get approval for subdivision of property. And the idea for that is a subdivision statute makes sure that we have adequate provisions for things like sewer, water, streets. So that's how we go through the process of subdividing property. You know, you apply for a plat approval, and you divide the property, you get that approval, and then we review to make sure that there are adequate provisions for streets, etc. And basically, the idea is to make sure there's a uniform system throughout the state for the subdivision of land. That's where the basis of that is. So it applies to sale, lease, or transfer of ownership. So even subdivision via lease is subject to the Subdivision Act. We have these cell towers, which are springing up like mushrooms in Vancouver. It was common for the cell tower companies putting up their cell towers to want to lease a pad on somebody's property, and as it turned out, you know, it's like, well, wait a second, if you're dividing the property by lease, you have to go through the subdivision process, and that wasn't really great, but that's what the subdivision statute said, and enough people got held up by that they amended the law so there's an exception for subdivision or lease of cell tower sites. So I often see these little, you know, like Dutch Brothers or these small coffee shops that are set up. I'm sure they're leasing the pads, but nobody's making them go through subdivision. But anyway, division of property even by lease is subject to subdivision statute. And those regulations will contain also substantive requirements that you can impose as part of the subdivision process. The last thing I want to talk about, before on this topic anyway, I know, I'm getting the wrong button. Impact fees. Impact fees are optional, I want to emphasize that first, but under GMA, jurisdictions can impose impact fees. And impact fees are, again, another way to soften the impact of development, hence the name impact fees. So impact fees might be school impact fees, traffic impact fees, or park impact fees. And the idea is if you're putting in a new subdivision, for example, we know that there are going to be people who are going to then be, you know, attending the local schools. So they might be assessed school impact fees that will go help to offset the cost of the impact of the school district. Or again, if it's a residential subdivision, they might be assessed park impact fees because the people living in that subdivision will be using the parks. So it's a funding mechanism. And for other projects, commercial as well as residential, traffic impact fees. So if you're going to have a new McDonald's, for example, you know it's going to generate a lot of traffic, and that's going to put more cars on the road, which means more congestion. So they might be assessed traffic impact fees to help pay for a traffic signal or road widening. The idea isn't that that owner of the McDonald's franchise has to pay for that new signal head, but it'll go into a pool, has to be extended within a certain period of time, and collectively, all the development which is causing the impact of the traffic system shares in the cost of development. Same thing with park impact fees and school impact fees. It helps fund the improvements caused by development. Again, they are optional and they are available to jurisdictions planning under the Growth Management Act. I know. Okay. Am I going backwards? Okay. Okay, good. One other thing I'm going to talk about that's really critical and important for you as planning commissioner and city council members is what the difference between what we call legislative acts and administrative acts. Typically, a legislative act is adopting a new section of your city code, something of that nature. That's legislative. That's something that's given a lot of discretion by the courts, and it applies generally throughout the community, right? If you're adopting a new revision to your subdivision code, that doesn't apply to a particular project, that applies to all projects, so that's legislative. The other piece of it is quasi-judicial. So if you are determining the rights of a particular individual regarding their property, for example, a building permit application or a request for a boundary line adjustment or something of that nature, you are acting sort of in a quasi-judicial role. That is, you are making determinations whether this particular property owner can do this or not. That's important to you as planning commissioners and city council members because if you are acting in a quasi-judicial capacity, determining the rights of an individual, what we have what's called the state's appearance of fairness doctrine applies. And that means procedures have to not only be fair, they have to appear to be fair. So to that end, you can't have any communications with proponents of the project outside the hearing. So for example, if you're on the planning commission and somebody is proposing a rezone of a single property, that's quasi-judicial because we're looking at an isolated parcel. They stand to gain or lose financially. It's not something that applies citywide. If they approach you as a planning commissioner outside the hearing and say, hey, let me tell you about the benefits of this rezone, that's inappropriate because they're having an opportunity to address you as a planning commissioner or as a city council member and not have the other argument, the opposing viewpoint presented to you. So when it's that sort of quasi-judicial aspect of it, you can't talk to members of the community about it, you can't hear evidence about it, except in the hearing that's scheduled for it. So keep that in mind. Sometimes you may have heard somebody, a constituent walks up to you with a Fred Meyer and talks to you about the proposal. And you have to say, sorry, I can't talk about this project. This is coming in front of the planning commission next week. What you can do then is at the beginning of any quasi-judicial hearing, your staff will say, okay, this is a quasi-judicial hearing. We're going to now ask these following questions regarding the appearance of fairness doctrine. There's a little script they'll probably read through. Have any of you had any contact with anybody, pro or con, the project? And you'll raise your hand. Oh, yeah, I spoke to somebody at Fred Meyer about this project. You need to reveal to the public at large that you had a communication regarding this project outside the scope of the hearing. And that's so that everybody knows that, okay, he spoke to him about it, and he had a little, and basically the planning commission can say, yes, I've heard that, or somebody sent me a letter. As soon as I saw it was about this project, I stopped reading it because I knew a hearing was coming up. So you need to put it on the record and say, yes, I had this communication, we call it an ex parte communication, outside the scope of the hearing. And so long as you can say that you can still impartially hear this matter, despite somebody approaching you and giving you a little pro-con argument about it, you can stay there and hear the decision as a member of the planning commission or city council member. If you feel that you've prejudged the issue and you feel that even though you say, well, I think I can be fair, but you're a little concerned that somebody will file a legal challenge saying, yeah, this inappropriate. I've been deprived of due process because that planning commissioner had already prejudged the decision. They wrote on their Facebook that they're really excited about this rezone, something like that. What you need to do is you need to recuse yourself from that procedure. And that is in order to protect the process. And if you are a planning commissioner or a city council member and you decide that you cannot fairly and impartially hear a matter, what you need to do is you need to leave the room. And there have been cases on this where the planning commissioner said, well, you know, I've had communication, I don't think I should be sitting up on this. So he moved from here and he sat there, and it wasn't good enough. And he was sort of nodding his head and shaking his head for the other planning commissioner, well, that's not a good idea. And so it was found to be void, you know. And that's what, you don't want to do that. I mean, you want to protect the process. So if somebody is spending, and they are, thousands of dollars to go through the staff work and the hearing and the notification process to get their project in front of you, you don't want to upset the apple cart just by a violation of the appearance fairness doctrine like that. Because the opponents would seize upon that, and fairly so, because they're entitled, the public's entitled to fair hearing, the proponents and opponents are all entitled to fair hearing. How many good for time, by the way?
You're out.
I'm out. I tend to get wrong. Okay, well, I'm pretty much out of ideas too. But anyway, I did want to talk about that because that's a practical thing that as planning commissioners and city council members you will run into, and that's really where the rubber meets the road when we talk about procedural process and subdivision process. The legal theory is one thing. The practicalities of providing for a fair hearing is really why I'm here tonight. Okay? I'm out of here.
Questions for Jim? Any questions before Jim is the floor? I think there's one over here. No?
Well, we'll be talking at all about SEPA anymore.
That was it.
That was it, okay. So I have a question, by the way. So I'm kind of wondering, when it comes to our local governments, who makes the decision on the time frame for which you're allowed to respond when one of the SEPA ratings has gone out? You know, they send a letter out.
Oh, the comment period, that's set by state law.
That's a state law. And is
Yeah,
there a
there's
designated amount of
statutory
time?
state. Pardon me?
Is there a designated amount of time? Is
Yeah,
there-
you'll see in the SEPA notice, when it goes out to whoever is entitled to notice, it'll say on there how much time you
And I'm
have.
asking who governs that amount of time, because it appears to
State
be
law,
very,
your legislature.
it's very short, it's like 2 weeks.
Yeah, it's state law that mandates that, and
The
really,
state law says you only give 2 weeks.
is it 2 weeks? I haven't looked at it in a long time.
14 days.
Okay, 14 days, right, that sounds right, but
14 days minimum.
Well,
No,
see, that's what I'm wondering,
it's-
because in many cases, people don't have enough time to catch their breath, to understand the nature of the thing, to even understand how to challenge.
you see sometimes the comment period be reopened, and correct me, those who do this for a living, if there is a change in the project, or there's a new information, there's a process for amending the SEPA, and that would open a new comment period. But otherwise, in the normal course of things, you know, if you feel the period is too brief to adequately comment, that's state law, talk to your state legislator. I mean, your local planner can't change that.
And is there a geographic distance from which the event is happening that those SEPA notices need to go out? Is it within 200 feet, 300 feet, 500 feet?
Locally here it's 300.
300 feet?
And as I mentioned before, local jurisdictions set that based upon the community and practical considerations like it costs a lot more as that circle expands, exponentially costs. So yeah, that's right.
So that's a state legislation issue.
The notification radius isn't state, I don't believe that's local.
Because one would assume that the area being impacted would impact people more than their designated space, 300 feet. There could be people who live at 500, 1,000, 600.
It's going to depend upon the
Who
project.
care
and
about
the
what's
business.
happening, right?
It's going to
Okay.
depend upon.
I was just curious about that time frame.
Great, thank you. There'll be more questions, time for questions at the end. Now we come to the more detailed part where we talk about comprehensive planning under the Growth Management Act. I want to point out our new logo. Department of Commerce. We are many faceted. In fact, we do all of these things. Community services, crime safety, community facilities, planning, infrastructure. In fact, just through our division, there's $2 billion per biennium for things like behavioral health facilities, child care, sewer, water. We have a big grant program for housing, and we have another division. It's billions of dollars that comes through our agency, right to your communities, and we're proud to be able to provide that funding and get it out and work for Washington. So we're going to talk about why we plan. We're going to talk about the framework that the GMA sets up. Oh. Hold the ball back again. There we go. Okay, can you hear me now? Here, we're trading the ball.
This one. Ooh.
Green, ooh, the green light's on now. Okay, can you just go ahead? Then we're going to talk about implement this when it works, implementing the plan and an update requirement. So first, why is planning important? Well, there's the GMA, but we've been planning cities for 2,000 years. I have a fabulous swag cup from the City of Vancouver Planning Commission that talks about Socrates, saying that planning cities is one of the most amazing things that we do. So, and planning, when we plan things just go better. Think of your last terrible vacation. So, what do we plan? To protect the good things about our community? What's here now that's really valuable that we should protect? What's not here yet and we need? How are we going to figure out which is the most important thing, what our priorities are, and how are we going to pay for that? And along the way, we build our community and a clear vision of where we want our community to be. There's a couple other more direct things, like Jim talked about. So if you have a piece of property and you want to build on it, planning lets you know exactly what kinds of things are allowed there and what the provisions and requirements are. It also lets you know what your neighbors are allowed to build, and if applicable, gives you notice of when you can provide comments. The other reason, and the really important reason in Washington State, is that we are a fabulous place to live. Who wouldn't want to come here in these dark and rainy nights? But people are coming here at an extraordinary rate for our economy, for our natural beauty, because our housing is relatively affordable. So this is the natural growth rate for Washington. This is Washingtonians making more Washingtonians. And this is the migration rate. And you can see it moves right with the economy. And this is not the slide. I updated this, but it had information that people are coming here from California mostly, but from all over the U.S. And obviously, when times are not so good, like they're during the recession, they're leaving again. But our trend rate is up. So this is the 2012 projection from our State Office of Financial Management for how we're going to grow. I just looked at these new numbers again. And this number is now well over 9 million. So we've upped the 2040 projection in the last 5 years because more people are coming here. Is that the only presentation that's up here?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's too bad.
Is it? Do you want me to look at it?
Because I had some updates. So here is, so the State Office of Financial Management, they figure out what our state population growth is going to be based on birth rates, death rates, migration, employment, other factors, and they set a county-wide projection for each county in Washington State.
Hold on, is this?
So this is the one for Clark County, and you can see the population growth rate has been stunning. It's 100% from 1985 to 2005. And the line continues straight up. So a very strong growth rate for Clark County. This rivals what's in the Puget Sound region, which is where this genesis of the Growth Management Act was. And the story goes that in 405, which is a notorious highway on the east side of Seattle, the traffic was terrible, and it's still terrible. And the Speaker of the House was sitting in traffic saying, oh my gosh, we're stuck in traffic, and there's still all this building going on. Someone ought to plan and coordinate all this growth. That's the only one there?
No, look.
I had some pretty cool.
Okay, hold on. Let's see if we get your cool stuff.
That's nice, right?
That's good, that's cool, right?
So in 1990, the state adopted the Growth Management Act, and it was to set a statewide framework, and it was to respond to the threats to our natural beauty and to our quality of life in Washington State. And it sets a framework. It says, here's the things that communities should consider as they plan for their future. We should make sure that infrastructure is in place. We should make sure that there is adequate housing, which we have not done a good job of. We are 225,000 units short in Washington State, so that we don't have adequate housing and the prices are way beyond what they are. We should make sure that we have adequate sewer and water service to serve the community. We should make sure that those communities are compact enough so that serving them with sewer and water and roads is cost efficient. We should put all of that growth within urban areas, so it's very much more cost efficient to serve them with not only sewer, water, and roads, but parks, fire service, emergency response. And we need to preserve those external areas that are used for ag, forest, and natural beauty.
Try to click forward.
Thank you. So in Clark County, I looked up the growth rates. In 040, in the Growth Management Act, it says in 1995, if you had a population of 50,000 or more and a growth rate of more than 10%, then you need to plan under the Growth Management Act. So Clark County is well above the 10% threshold. And after that, if there's a county that has population growth of more than 17%, then you have to plan under the Growth Management Act. So in 1995, counties either were told to plan under the Growth Management Act, or a great many opted in. And since then, there's none that have had to opt in for population growth, although there's a few nearing that threshold. We covered this. So there's 14 GMA planning goals. And you'll notice that they're supposed to be non-prioritized, and some of the language is soft. Some say encourage, like compact urban growth, reduce sprawl, or encourage multimodal transportation, affordable housing, economic development, and some are much more certain. Like we have to protect property rights. That's what Jim talked about. Permitting needs to be predictable. If you have a proposal that's consistent with the zoning, then you should know that you're very likely to get the permit. We want to maintain our natural resource industries and open space and protect the environment and ensure the availability of public services. Encourage historic preservation, and the last one is Shorelines, which was added later. So the first thing when the GMA was passed was that we had to protect the our natural resource land. The Land Speaks First comes from a hearings board case. So we said, look for agricultural, land, forest, and mineral, those are important for our economy. So we want to identify where they are, protect them. The ag is based on soil, forest is based on large parcels, accessibility to markets, and really designate them as special resource lands of long-term significance. And the next thing they had to do was, so counties had to do that, and then all cities and counties had to designate and protect environmentally critical areas. They use the best available science, and we have a piece of our advisory code which defines what that is. I mean, peer-reviewed science that says either it's local or it's information from the state, or a study that says this is why we have to protect the resource. For example, for fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas are like, well, that needs large trees to feed the stream, so we need a certain buffer so that those trees can fall into the stream. We can't have a shorter buffer. So 5 areas. There's 1, frequently flooded areas and geologically hazardous areas. Those are ones that you need to stay back from, to protect human property and human health. Mother Nature is very powerful, especially with stronger storms and climate change. And we are seeing less insurance available in areas that are risky. The next one is aquifer recharge areas, and those are areas that feed the aquifers that we use for potable drinking water, which is very important to protecting our source of water. So there's two ways that we protect that. One is we make sure that there's no hazardous uses where soils are particularly pervious, like gravel areas, and around wellheads, because that's a punch from the soil right down to the aquifer, so you want to make sure there's no hazardous uses around there. And also, we don't want to pave over land so that the water can't infiltrate the aquifer. There's some wildlife habitat conservation areas are protect habitat for fish, for endangered species that might be set at the federal, state, or the local level. And finally, wetlands. These two, they have important biological functions that are often irreplaceable. So we need to identify what those are and protect them. There's a lot more detail on all of these. If you want to go to our website, you can find more guidance. So if you are fully or partially planning, you have different requirements. Remember I talked about the growth rates and who had to plan? So all of the ones in green were growing fast in 1995, and they were required to plan under the Growth Management Act. The ones in blue opted in because there was planning money at the time, and they saw a lot of value in the planning framework offered by the GMA. Berry County just opted out. There was a provision to allow that, so they just became part of the gray, which planned for only the critical areas and the natural resource lands. So if you are fully planning, you have a whole other set of requirements. The first one is to adopt countywide planning policies, and those are a regional framework to plan for our future growth. They set a framework for how we designate urban growth areas, how we plan for countywide facilities, such as highways or airports, or those facilities called essential public facilities, which nobody really wants in their community, but we need one in the county. So we set up a system to identify where that should go. Affordable housing is a regional issue because people drive until they can afford a house. So it makes sense to look at affordable housing as a regional issue and maybe set targets for how much affordable housing we'll need based on the needs within the region. Or adopt strategies as a county. This is actually a discussion in the legislature. Like, how do we get counties to more fully plan for affordable housing? Or economic development in the Puget Sound, they have multi-county planning policies, so there's even another layer. So here's Washington's urban growth areas. They're all set all over the state, but mostly in the high population areas. And it's a really small part of our mass. And here's how we take that countywide population projection. So Clark County gets a given population. Some of it gets allocated to a rural area, a very small amount, 10 to 15%, 20% statewide, because we want to push all that population into urban areas because it's much more efficient to serve it, right? And then within the cities, and then, so this is the incorporated city. Vented city, you can pack as many people as you want in there. If you want to upzone, it's okay. And here there is unincorporated urban growth area, which means it's eventually just supposed to be urban. It was sized when the city, when the GMA first came, to be able to accommodate the growth within the county. And all of the urban growth areas countywide are added up to absorb the future population. So some counties, they're not adding to the urban growth area, but they're saying, well, this town has some more space over here. This town has extra wastewater treatment facilities. This one really can't handle any more, and they want to pull in their urban growth area and pop it out over there. Or some towns are like, oh my gosh, we have too much land and it's too expensive to serve. We haven't sewered it, it's been 25 years. Maybe we should think about pulling it in if it's not already urban. So as a countywide level, the population growth is allocated to rural areas, to the cities, and to the urban growth areas. And if there's not enough room because there's so much population coming in, then you're allowed to say, well, we need, given the existing zoning, and we can't really upzone, we can't take these reasonable measures, we need to pop out our urban growth area a little bit more because we have 20 years of population to plan for. So it's limited by that 20-year projection from the state. There are 7 counties that have to do a buildable lands program. So that means they look back at their development to see how they've done, did we accomplish the zoning that we set out to do? And then they look forward. Do we have sufficient capacity for residential and employment growth? There's a Clark County Buildable Lands report that you can go look at from 2017. The next reports are due in 2021. And then if you don't have sufficient capacity, or if your projections, if the development doesn't plan what you projected, if it's falling short, we were going to have 6 dwelling units per acre, and we only got like 4.5. Then you have to look at reasonable measures so that development more aligns with what you planned. So reasonable measures are like higher zoning, allowing duplexes, incentives to encourage higher density, other forms of encouraging development to be higher. So we've done a short course for, I think Commerce has done it for 30 years, and CAW's done it for more than 40, but we've never talked about what good planning is. We've only talked about the process. So I wanted to share some ideas. This is from 1920. This is Ebenezer Howard's Garden City, the slumless, smokeless cities. And he says, in order to accommodate people, we need to have them within these walkable neighborhoods. We need to link them up with good quality transportation and to have some open space in between. That's going to be our healthy, smokeless, slumless city where people are going to want to live. And guess what? 100 years later, we're still planning like that. It may not be as open in the middle, but we're still planning high-density nodes collected by high-quality transportation. This is the gold standard in good planning all over the world. And so the rural areas are low density, low development. We have rural levels of service, which means we don't have sewer. We definitely have a lower response rate for emergency services. And then in the cities, we have that higher level of standard. Another way to look at how your community is working is, does it work for people? Can you walk to places? Are you mixed? How do your kids get along? The non-drivers, are they surviving well? Are there jobs within your community? So there's a jobs housing balance. Is there open space and parks so people can live, play, work in your house, in your community? So let's get to the Growth Management Act. There are 5 required elements in a comprehensive plan. Land use, where you set out the distribution of land uses. You also look at stormwater and groundwater and physical activity. We added that in 2005 because we wanted to create communities where people could be physically active. The others, transportation, housing, utilities, and capital facilities, are an inventory of what we have now. What do we have now, and what are we going to need in 20 years when our population grows? What are the facilities we're going to need? What does our housing need to look like? Where do we need to extend our sewer and water so everybody has, and roads so that they have service that we have projected for our future. And then for counties, they have to define and protect rural character. That's like a variety of densities and established policies to define what your rural character looks like where you are. The plan has to be coordinated and consistent. So are the assumptions in all the elements the same for numbers of people? Does it use the same boundaries? Can you provide public facilities concurrent with the development? And if you do your 20-year plan and you look at what it's going to cost for roads, sewer, et cetera, to meet your level of standards for the whole community, and you can't figure out how you're going to pay for it within 20 years, you need to go back and reassess the land use element Maybe there's another way we could do this more efficiently. It also needs to be consistent with countywide planning policies. So you can look up Clark County countywide planning policies, just Google them, and you'll see what they are, and your local plans should be consistent with those. And you should pass your plan around to adjacent jurisdictions, because it'd be great if your facilities lined up. You adopt the plan through the planning commission, and then it's recommended, and then elected officials make the decision. You have to complete that in CEPA environmental review, send it to the state 60 days before, so the state has an opportunity to review the plan. And then the city or the council has only them the authority to adopt the plan. It can only then be amended once per year, because it's intended to be a long-range planning document. Not supposed to go back with the political winds. It's supposed to be looking at general direction, and so that all the policies can be adopted cumulatively, so you can see what the impact is. But it has to be updated every 8 years by statute. So new population projections, new, maybe laws have changed. You need to go back, maybe your community has changed. Maybe you've accomplished a lot of the objectives that you had. So go back, update the plan. It can be a little update or a major update, that's up to you. If once adopted, it can be appealed to a growth management hearings board. That's like a court. It is set up in the Growth Management Act to get things quickly through the courts, so that they weren't bogged down in regular court, so that they could go to the hearings board and be concluded within 180 days. The other check on your local plan is that the transportation element has to be reviewed by a regional transportation planning organization. And they're set up to do a regional transportation plan. So they are the ones, we don't certify. We just provide recommendations, and we track who's completed their updates. But the RTPOs certify the transportation element, so that you're get ability to collect funding. To implement the comprehensive plan, you use your development regulations that Jim talked about, the capital improvement plan. How are you going to spend your money? Any of the money that you spend has to be in your capital facilities plan, or you can use other kind of volunteer activities or incentive programs to implement the goals in your plan. The idea is that by working through this process, every permitted project is consistent with your plan and every spending decision, so that through time, the vision in your plan becomes real. So here's some examples of development standards. The traditional zoning, which traditionally have maximum densities, although we're getting away from that. We're moving towards this discussion of more lower residential with multiple forms of housing. Subdivisions process sets up the process for dividing land, or other regulations such as design standards. Landscaping can help you regulate the appearance of development. You should be careful to think about the impact that it has on affordability and the amount of housing that you can get in your community. Capital facilities is how we, Jim talked about concurrency, meaning that we have to have facilities in place at the time of development. Updates are due every 8 years. As you can see, the next one from Clark County is due in 2024. And if you have not completed the update, or if you have an outstanding hearings board appeal, then you are ineligible for those grants and loans on the right-hand side. That's all I have.
Go back to that slide, please.
I did have a slide with some great growth rates, but I'm not sure what happened.
So what happens if a jurisdiction does not meet GMA?
It does not need GM, like one of
Does
the,
not meet, they in certain growth and for what housing, for the population. What happens if a city or jurisdiction does not provide enough housing?
we have a statewide deficit of 225,000 units. So there are some teeth built into the comprehensive plan, but a city doesn't build housing. They only set the environment for private development to make their investment. So right now, the governor and all the legislators are getting together with a lot of wild, crazy ideas to offer tools and incentives to help communities set the framework for more housing and to try to get more housing into the space. But as a city itself, if there are no tools, that's just the way it is. So in King County, they said, we're gonna have benchmarks. We're gonna say that you must have 12% of your housing affordable to people making less than half the median income. And as one city did not, was planning large lots, and they were appealed. And the hearings board said, "Yeah, clearly, you're not meeting that benchmark." And they had to go back and amend the plan to provide enough small density and small units and higher density so that they could meet that benchmark.
So there's two questions. First one's real quick. Since you mentioned that counties opt into the program, is that they're locked in for a certain amount of time? Can you opt out at any time if you have that choice?
If you are under the threshold, transportation threshold, you can opt out. But if you were, or the population threshold. So Ferry County was under that threshold. But if you're opted in, like Benton is one of the fastest growing places in the state, they can't opt out because they've reached those population thresholds.
Okay. And then there's a specific question. It's concerning the GMA. I've heard an argument before from a municipality that kind of flips it on its head a bit, where the intention, as you explained it, was that it would help to temper overgrowth, rapid growth. Is there anything in the GMA that penalizes a community for undergrowth, for not meeting these standards quick enough, just because the demand isn't necessarily there in that community?
There's a lot of communities like that with massively oversized UGAs that are not growing. But as a county, all of the cities and counties have to make sure there's adequate capacity for that growth at a countywide level. But if nobody chooses to come to your community, what are you going to do, right?
Yeah, so there'll be no penalization that's come down the pipe and affected anybody for that reason?
Yeah, just quick. I mean, the way GMA and these plans are refined, somebody has to file an appeal. The cities and counties have an obligation under GMA to plan for growth, make adequate provisions. So really, as Ann said, cities don't build houses, but you have to have land zoned for appropriate residential development. Densities, for example. And if your zoning doesn't allow the density that will accommodate the growth, then that growth will happen. So it's going to take somebody appealing the adoption of the plan. So let's say the plan is all 5-acre lots and there's no high-density development, so it can't accommodate the growth. Well, the growth board's not going to do anything. It's like a court. Somebody has to come to the community and participate in it, and get standing, and then appeal to the growth board. Then the growth board has the ability to say to yeah, you're right, you didn't accommodate growth because there's too much low-density zoning, not enough high-density zoning, and they can remand it back to the jurisdiction, and the jurisdiction has to take another stab at it, and then they come back to the board for another hearing, and it goes back and forth, sometimes for years, until the growth board finally said, okay, you're now in compliance. As Dan said, the implications are they're ineligible for getting certain funding, and in the worst case scenario, this declaration of invalidity, projects can't vest under the development standards if the growth board finds that the codes and the plan substantially interferes with the GMA. That doesn't happen that often, but they have that ability to do that. But it's up to the citizens. FutureWise is a local environmental advocacy group that does a lot of appeals to the hearings board. And a lot of times it's, I'm not sure they're still around, they were when I was down here, Clark County Natural Resources Council filed a lot of GMA appeals. So somebody's got to be watching. And somebody, if nobody files an appeal, it's adopted, and then after 60 days, it's a fait accompli.
Yeah, we don't certify, we don't approve. Department of Ecology for the shoreline master programs, they approve them and they adopt them with you. But we don't have a role.
So, the population that you're all supposed to plan for is looked at as a county, right? In other words, what if Camas says, well,
It's,
Can Camas sit there and say, well, what do we base our growth on? What we're expecting based on our own trend, right?
so that's a process worked out in most counties in the countywide planning policies. You get the countywide projection and you base it on who has space or who has facilities, or if you were under a moratorium because you just can't deal with public facilities. But it's allocated, and it's allocated how many population are expected to go in each community.
The Office of Financial Management does a population projection, and they give a low, medium, and high projection, and I think the county has the ability to decide what framework. And the county allocates to various jurisdictions, and then it's a little bit of a horse trading and subject to appeal in terms of how that population is allocated.
So the county decides on which of those three, and then rolls it out to each of the areas within the county.
It's generally a negotiated process.
It is a negotiated process.
These are public elected officials from the county and all the cities.
Right.
And so it's a game of poker. You have to take this much. Who wants to take these chips? Who can accommodate it?
So then what about infrastructure? So if we decide this is Camas's park, and so here's a project called North Shore within our UGA, going to develop all the pieces that are encouraged. But then we're looking at transportation, roads, and then we have a state road that's going to become very messy. Will the state come in then and help us with these corridors that we now need to really get boosted? Because in order for all the planning to happen, how they all will get out, we're all going to be using this narrow old SR 500 and what happens to those pieces? Like who comes in and helps?
So that's,
Don't touch that.
well, if you have an urban growth area, it's expected that it's going to become urban. So the expectation is that we're going to plan for urban development. So maybe you want to do like a plan for that area so you understand what the infrastructure needs are. If there's a state facility, the state, well, there's the Regional Transportation Planning Organization here, and they do a regional transportation plan. If it's a state highway, the state has a state highway plan, and if they decide yours needs some improvement, they put it on the 10 or 20-year highway improvement plan.
So that, because if we can't touch that, that's the states, they have to be part of it, and if we are doing this as part of GMA compliance, should they not, don't they owe us that?
So there, if you look in the GMA, under the transportation element for the 3670A 0705 maybe, it says that as you do your transportation element, you're supposed to let the state know of the impacts of your system on their system.
And if they can't meet the needs we need, it impacts.
It's many layers of complicated transportation planning is a whole other ball of wax.
So I love your analogy of poker chips because it allows me to ask a question that might seem kind of dumb,
Okay.
but I want to ask it. So if we're all sitting at the table, we're deciding on who gets what poker chips, you know, in Clark County.
I mean, based on your
Camas
ability
has to
to
do this
accept them.
much, Vancouver has to do this much. If all of many other counties exceed their growth number, you know, they're supposed to have 10,000 growth and they get 55. Does it ever get redistributed? Okay, yeah, sorry, you know what I mean? How often does that factor that we are given to grow, how often does it get redistributed? Can it actually get reduced on the next
So
review?
the State Office of Financial Management does projections every 5 years. The 2012 one was, we're going to have 8.5 million people. The 2017 was going to have another 500,000 people. So we're all growing, and they're looking at each county individually, and they're following their trends very carefully, and they don't direct where it goes. They just estimate where people are going to make their own decisions. And given the issues with housing affordability, we have a responsibility to plan for those, but plan for a way that works for your community. These people are coming here. How many have moved here in the last 5 years? Why'd you come? Climate? Economy? Family? People are coming here, so we're going to have to find a place for them to live. Let's plan in a way that makes sense for our community so that as we're building new houses, it's what we want to see here. Does that make sense? Okay, let's take a break. We'll be back in like 6 minutes. We're running a little late for our next session. Thank you.
It is time. Welcome back. Have a seat again.
Come on, see you're right there next to Norris, right?
Okay, we're going to continue tonight. We're going to talk about something a little bit different than the flavor you've received so far, which is about all of the human beings that are involved in making all of that complicated process and legal requirement, procedural requirements actually work. I don't know if anyone's told you, but planning is aspirational. It's looking forward, and it's hard. And it depends on everybody in this room and everyone in the communities to participate. And so I'm going to talk about that participation and what it looks like from different angles. To give you a little sense of who I am, I'm not from this area. I'm from California, originally. I apologize. I don't know what the statute of limitations on that is in terms of becoming a Washingtonian, but I have been working in local planning in Washington for the last 20 years. And I'm going to talk about all these different roles, and I've played almost all of these different roles in planning in Washington, except an elected official. Haven't done that yet. But I have served as a local planning commissioner in Thurston County. I served as a planning commissioner and at times the chair of the planning commission for 8 years. I started out in Thurston County as a staffer, as a senior planner. Dealt with lighthearted issues like critical areas regulations and shorelines and agricultural lands and mining, major industrial development. I've staffed large hearings with 300 people and metal detectors at the door. I've worked with small community stakeholder groups that are trying to come to consensus around an issue. I'm really happy to say that in every part of my work, I've seen really dedicated people who are coming from a place of good intention. We don't always present that best self to one another when we're dealing with charged planning topics, because planning is emotional and it's difficult, and we're all coming at it from different wants and needs and moods. But I can say really honestly that I've been really impressed and inspired by the level of participation I've seen from folks throughout my career in the planning process. So it's something we should be proud of in Washington. And we don't look like California for a reason. So I'm going to go over these roles in planning and how they link to actual land use planning decisions, and then give some tips and tricks about effective meetings, whether you're a staffer, an elected official, a planning commissioner, or a citizen. So the sausage making process of a planning project, from the light bulb idea all the way through to an adopted ordinance and policy and then implementation, looks scary and complicated, and I don't know that the presentations you've heard tonight have disabused you of the notion that it's scary and complicated, because there's a lot to it. And your professional planning staff who dedicate their careers to working on these issues and have to know all of that stuff are a great resource for you if you're confused about what's going on. So take advantage of those folks in your community. But it's more than just staff. I mean, planning doesn't happen without all of these folks. Elected officials, obviously, the planning commission, who are appointed by these elected officials, whose job is to represent the community and volunteer their time and have late night meetings and listen to people and make decisions and recommendations. Staff, for some project decisions, of course, those go to a hearings examiner locally. There's other appointed bodies. You might have a bike and pedestrian committee or a historic commission. Counties will have an agriculture advisory committee. There's lots of folks engaged that elected officials have to hear from in order to make good decisions. There's the general public, obviously, and then there's parts of the general public that are organized in our environmental groups or development and building groups. There's agencies, state agencies. One of the things I've done in my career is I was a technical assistance provider working for the Department of Fish and Wildlife, trying to tell wildlife biologists how to go to a planning commission meeting and talk about the importance of planning for wildlife. That's not easy. That's not easy for a biologist to do. And I hope that we improved along the way. So this is a relationship. This is not a hierarchy. All of these folks involved in planning are linked to one another, and it doesn't happen without all of them linking together. City council and elected policymakers appoint, as I said, their planning commission. That's huge. Who's on that planning commission really matters. So kudos to folks in here who have volunteered and been appointed to a planning commission. That's a lot of work. The planning commission back to city council is making recommendations. The city council has to take these recommendations in and think about the hard work and process that went into them and whether or not that aligns with the decision they want to make. And if it doesn't, they can still make a different decision, but they need to circle back and tell the planning commission why. An important relationship is obviously with professional planning staff, their work plans, what they're going to work on, if they're going to do a sub-area plan this year, if they're going to look at a rezone this year. This is all guided by their elected policymakers who prioritize the work that's going to be done in a given year. They're also working as staff to a planning commission, group of citizens who are asking them for technical information, who are relying on them to explain why we must do XYZ planning process, and who are relying on them to set up the meetings and the logistics and bring people to the table to learn about the process. So again, all relationships. The public is engaged in all of these circles and in all of the steps through a planning process. One of the most important jobs of a planning commissioner or a staff person or a city council member or elected county official is to be able to clearly explain to the public where they can be heard throughout the process. When's the public hearing? When's the meeting you need to attend? Here's the What Project website. Here's handouts that take you through the steps in the process. Here's the timeline. Here are the goals. here's the funding and how much we have to invest. And that's maybe why we're not doing the gold standard. Maybe we just have to do this much because we only have this much budget this year for this planning process. But the public needs to know all of this in order to be able to effectively engage in the process. So I'll break those down a little bit more. So the final decision-making on any plan, ordinance, development project, unless it's quasi-judicial and it went through a hearing examiner, is going to be the elected council. So these are folks who are in your community for a reason. They want to lead your community, to make it strong, to make it economically viable, to make it have all of those amenities that you all want, and you elect them. And it's their job to make final decisions. Easy enough. But throughout that, they need to do certain things in order to be effective leaders. They have to respect and support their planning commissioners. They will put people on a planning commission to advise them. They should listen to what the planning commission has to say. They have to make careful decisions about who they put on the planning commission. A good planning commission will help get planning projects smoothly through even the most complex projects. A good planning commission, run properly, will be able to help facilitate projects all the way through the planning process, all the way up to a recommendation to City Council in a pretty smooth fashion. But not all planning commissions function really well. Sometimes people come to a planning commission or are appointed to a planning commission with an agenda or a perspective. That's okay, that's reality. We're humans, right? We're going to come with our own view of the world and what should happen. But the elected official's job is really to make careful choices there, to really think about, is this person going to represent broad community interests? Or are they going to balance out the planning commission in a way? Maybe we have a really left-leaning environmental green planning commission, and we need to sort of balance that. The Growth Management Act is about balance. It has 14 goals. Some are about development, some are about preservation. You have to have a balanced planning commission in order to get a balanced product at the end. Also, take time. Elected officials are very busy, pressed for time. We all are. But take the time to really understand how the planning commission arrived at its recommendation. What were the reasons and rationale? Do they align with the county strategic plan, with your vision of where you're going? And you can disagree. Just because an advisory body advises an elected official on a certain path to take, elected officials can go in a different direction. But when they do, explain why. Go back to the planning commission, explain why, and go to the public and explain why. There shouldn't be any mystery. All of this process is totally designed to be as transparent as possible. I also call this rewarding the planning commission, because often what an annual get-together looks like is maybe a dinner that city or county pays for, where the volunteers on the planning commission get to have a meal with their elected officials and just talk about how the relationship's going. Again, this is all about relationships. Provide direction, provide resources, make sure the planning commission has the staff it needs, the logistical pieces it needs, and understands the scope of a project that's being worked on. If you're a planning commissioner, you're a policy advisor. So you're trying to represent the community view of what's a good regulation, what's a good idea, what's a good plan, what's a good project. Sometimes you're in a position, like Jim talked about, you may be making quasi-judicial decisions. I don't know if the Camas Planning Commission does that. In Thurston County, our planning commission doesn't necessarily do much of this, but a rezone could be one of them that you're reviewing. So you have to make sure you're doing it legally and fairly and in accordance with the law. Your obligations as a planning commissioner, you have them too. You have to respect and support the city council, a lot of what I talk about is a respect and mutual support. It goes both ways. You have to understand that just because you're going to recommend something to the council, they may not go with your recommendation. This is the hard part, because sometimes staff likes to give you 40-page information packets or more, and you have to read them all. Or regulations that are in red, strike out, underline, and go on endlessly. You have to read them all. It's a big commitment for a planning commissioner. I think the public needs to know that too, because these are volunteers. They're having night meetings usually. They're having to do all of this reading and understand all of this jargon, and they weren't trained as planners. Most of the time they're from other industries or other backgrounds, so it's a lot of work. But you have to do it. If you're not prepared to do it, don't be a planning commissioner or whatever you do. Listen to the public. It's hard sometimes if someone's standing at a podium like this, literally crying about how a project might impact them, or if they're angry, or if they're feeling vulnerable. You still have to listen and take in their information and focus on what pieces of that information are important to this community in making this decision. There's a difference between personal feelings and ideologies and facts and emotions and strategies. It's your job to sort through all of those and see what's important for the community to listen to. But definitely listen. Have an open mind and respect who you're hearing and respect each other on the commission. Debating is a lost art, I feel like, in our country right now, but I think that where we can sort of restore its value is at advisory committees like planning commissions, where you can work together and try to persuade each other. Planning commissions often are made up of people who aren't going to necessarily agree right off the bat on any project brought before them. But if they can operate using civility and setting a model for the community of how to debate rather than argue, to persuade, that's going to go a long way in the planning process. At a hearing, make sure that you're behaving professionally. So as a planning commissioner, address people by their title, by their first and last names, not just be like, oh, hey, John, it's good to see you tonight. I can't wait to hear your testimony. Again, to the appearance of fairness, that doesn't sound fair. People in the room want to know that they're all going to be equally heard, so act like a professional. And also, and this is important, staff is going to bring you a lot of facts and data and science to support your decision. Give a little deference to that. Staff spent years studying this stuff. They know when something's going to be illegal. They know when something's going to get appealed a lot of the time. They know what bad decisions look like, and they're going to be able to advise you about what a good decision is going to look like. Doesn't mean you have to agree with what the staff is putting forward. You can go in a different direction. But make sure when you're having your discussions and debate around which direction you want to go, you're relating back to the information staff has brought you. I don't agree with that study because of this. I want to go in this direction because I think there's another study that shows we should do this. And then, obviously, gracefully accept if your recommendation gets the thumbs down from your elected officials. That's their prerogative, and that will happen. I think we've covered all of this. The chair of the Planning Commission should really make being on the Planning Commission as fun as possible, as constructive as possible. You're volunteering. I mean, enjoy it a little bit. Treat people fairly. If you're using Robert's Rules of Order, use them. Read that little book. We in Thurston County have had, our struggles at times with how our Planning Commission operates. We fall back to our rules of procedure. We read through them. We're reminded of how we're supposed to operate. if we're arguing a lot about a lot of things, we start using motions. I move that we go in this direction. Second, vote, move forward. This is important too. When you're dealing with staff, staff is not there to take your individual direction. Planning Commissioner X wants staff to go out and run a whole new analysis. No, the Planning Commission needs to come as a body and agree if they need a new analysis, if they want a different report, if they want to explore a different option. As a body, you need to agree to that, or a majority needs to agree to that, and then you can ask staff to do that. Staff can't be running and doing projects based on an individual planning commissioner's whims. That's not an efficient use of staff resources, and it actually may be going outside of the scope and the intent of what the elected officials have asked the planning commission to look at in the first place. Obviously, come to the meetings. You'd be surprised. Do your homework, be prepared, be polite, avoid jargon, use plain talk. There's usually going to be an audience at planning commission meetings, certainly at hearings. Don't get caught up in jargon. These are all humans, these are your neighbors, these are your friends. Don't take it personally. That's a huge one, and that's super hard. That's hard for planning staff, and I think elected officials as well, certainly planning commissioners, when people are getting angry or upset in front of them, to not take it personally, to not feel responsible for that other person's emotions. And a certain part of it, you're going to be empathetic people, that's why you're volunteering and wanting to do this in the first place. But remember, there's a long-term vision the community has, there's goals for the project, there's a scope of the project, there's a reason, there could be a legal reason why you have to do something in a certain way. So just try to keep a little bit of space for that. And don't get too wrapped up in folks having a bad day in front of you at a hearing, because it's going to happen. So planning staff, sometimes it seems to the public that planning staff may come to a meeting or a planning commissioner meeting or an elected official meeting with a project that seems fully baked. They laid it, here's the recommended path. Here's the strike-through and underlying version of this code change. Here's the draft plan. It only seems that way because a lot of work goes into these projects before they get to the point where they're ready and right for the planning commission to see them, so that the planning commission has something to work with. Nothing's baked until it's adopted by the elected officials. Trust that the planning staff is doing their best to build options and to build a project that's legal, that meets the scope or the goals that the elected officials have defined for them. It may be something, there's a grant and they have a certain way they need to do a project in order to get money from the state to do it. And they're going to come with options that are going to be able to give you something to work with and that you can still change and mold and influence. But give them a little credit for doing all that hard professional work before they bring it to you, because it's coming from a place, again, of good intention. And then obviously, at the end of the day, planning staff are the ones that have to implement all this stuff. So if they're telling you in a meeting that your suggested code language isn't a great idea because it's going to be very hard to implement when someone comes in for a project permit 10 months later, listen to that. They have experience that they can bring to you to let you know how things are going to be the most effective at implementation. So again, two-way street. The City Council Planning Commission have some obligations to staff. They need to rely on them to both administer and enforce the regulations. But they aren't planners, they don't need to micromanage every step of the way. But they do need to make sure that priorities are clear for planning staff. This is especially true for elected officials. Don't adopt a docket of work for a year that's 15 rezones when you have 2 planning staff, because that's not going to get done. Make it clear what your priorities are for any given year so that you have the opportunity to have success. Give deference to their technical judgments, I said that. And if you're unhappy with how staff is working with you or for you, if you're an elected official or a planning commissioner, take the matter up, with that staffer's boss, planning director, whoever. Don't do it in a public meeting. Again, you're setting the tone for your whole community when you're sitting up on a dais or you're at a table acting in the capacity of advisory or elected. Don't berate staff in a public scenario. It's not going to help you and it's not going to help the public. So, and one of the reasons for that is that staff are playing a lot of different roles. They're conducting the whole process, they're making sure all the meetings and the notices go out, and the ordinances are written properly, and the code's written properly, and that people get notified to come to meetings. They're guiding you through the process. They're doing all the research and the technical work to bring you options. They're delivering messages about what the decisions are to back to the public and to the elected officials. And sometimes they have to be the enforcer. Certainly at the end of the day, once you've adopted something, they have to make sure it's actually implemented correctly. And they have obligations themselves, and they have to present things factually and objectively, and they're public servants, not advocates. So they're trying to come to the community with options that are going to reflect that public service value. They're trying to serve you and their elected and their citizenry. Let's see. So it's all about respect, really, at the end of the day. And answering questions. The job of the staffer is to really respond to the questions that elected and advisory officials have and members of the public. And that takes some time. So if you send an email and you don't get a response for a couple weeks, don't panic. It's going to take some time for a staff member some time to answer a question fully and responsibly. So this is right out of the GMA. Public participation has a whole goal. In the GMA, it's one of the 14 goals. Someone introduced themselves tonight, I think it was George, who said, I'm just a citizen. You have a whole goal in the GMA. You're not just a citizen. You're like a critical piece of making this all work. And part of that is providing for early and continuous public participation throughout every step of the way. That's why there are multiple hearings on projects. That's why there are open houses, flyers, web pages, stuff stuck on telephone poles, because we want to hear from you. And lastly, when we talk about the public, it's all different groups, it's all different folks. It's folks who've lived here forever and know how it used to be, maybe a little bit sad in the direction it's going, or maybe excited. The business community, it's environmental community, developers, media, and they're all going to come to public hearings and have a lot to say. So tips for managing that real quickly. Make sure everybody signs in, has a clear understanding of how much time they have to testify. That's critical. Using that red light, green light, yellow light, stop light really helps. And the chair of the Planning Commission needs to enforce that. We need to make it equal and fair among people testifying. Be patient, because sometimes citizens are nervous to be up here. It's nerve-wracking for me to be up here. It's nerve-wracking for all of us to do public speaking. So be patient. And be patient for people who are mad. People could get mad. It's not the end of the day. A lot of these decisions are going to make people mad. That's okay. But definitely talk about why and how, have an open public discussion about how you're thinking about the testimony you've received and what's really guiding your decision. Honor the testimony that you've received. I heard this, that doesn't really resonate with me because we have this goal and we need to go in this direction. Don't just ignore. And then use motions. Again, there's going to be multiple options that may be before you as a planning commission and as elected officials. Use a proper process where you're having a motion to approve or disapprove something. And then if you need to draft findings to explain your rationale, that is really useful, and that can go into your ordinance or your resolution at the end of the day. And why? Because FutureWise and lots of other folks are watching everything you do and are ready to appeal, and you need to keep a good record. You need to keep good minutes. You need to audio record, hopefully, your planning commission meetings and your elected official city council meetings. You need to keep all your documentation. Staff has to do all this. My staff is doing this right now because FutureWise appealed an element of our last comp plan update, and we're having to build the record right now. Luckily, we did great record keeping, so it's all about just going through our files and finding all of these facts, documents, notes from meetings, and reasons for why something was recommended in a certain way or approved or disapproved. So that's the end. I hope it wasn't too, mom-like. I am a mom, but any questions right now?
Yeah, thank you for this. I'm running for Clark County Council, and I'm curious about the county's role in coordination with the city planning commission and the council and basically the Growth Management Act revisions in 2024, what the sequencing is, how the coordination happens, and whether the county signs off on city plans and how they fit some coordination.
I think it's different, and Anne can correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's different in Rhea County a little bit. But I know elected officials all do get together and they're all under the countywide planning policies. And in Thurston County, we have a joint planning agreement that basically the county elected officials and the city elected officials will work together to plan together for the urban growth area portions that are administered still by the county, but are really about the city's future. And so they meet regularly, and the planning directors meet regularly. That's really helpful. If that doesn't exist, you should make that happen, because that's super helpful to make sure that you're jointly planning where you should be on major issues like infrastructure and transportation and water is particularly important. But for those urban growth areas, you need to make sure that you're not, the county isn't approving a bunch of projects in an urban growth area that's going to preclude that area from being successfully annexed to the city down the road, because that's one of the goals. So continuous communication and having forums where you can get together. But no, the county does not approve or disapprove what the city does for its own jurisdiction. They're two separate jurisdictions, and they have separate authorities and implement GMA in their own ways. That helps.
You mentioned FutureWise, and so they work with friends of Clark County, right?
I have no idea who they work with down here.
So the FutureWise is statewide, and they sort of the GMA watchdogs.
They're an environmental nonprofit, and yeah, they kind of have built a reputation as one of the watchdogs that are watching what we do and making sure, especially counties, are implementing the protection of natural resource lands and critical areas and rural densities appropriately. So yeah, they are one of the folks that, and I don't mind, because I think it's a good thing to have citizen groups that are going to hold everyone accountable and ask good questions and take us to task. So
Can they help local communities also be some of the local watchdogs? Can they work with us?
I have no idea. You'd have to contact FutureWise about that. That's a very interesting question. There's also a lot of good case law. You can search the Growth Management Hearings Board's websites, and you can see the kinds of cases and the decisions that have come before. It's all online, and you can kind of get a flavor of different opinions and decisions that have come before on planning topics that may be of interest to you or your community.
And how about for access?
Yeah, it's really good. Yeah.
This might be a Washington State question, but we have a large plot of land that is labeled as forest conversion. So is the term forest conversion a state thing, Or is that a city thing? And who makes the designation of something being a forest conversion, being labeled as so?
Sounds like a local land use designation.
So that's something that's done through the local, or it's not a
State
government?
law about forest lands converted, but I'm
Could
not
be
an expert
labeled
on that.
forest conversion.
You'd have to, planning staff, your question needs to be directed to your local planning staff. They can point you to the zoning ordinance that describes what forest conversion means. The comprehensive plan has probably policy
So that's
language.
state thing.
So the state requires you to preserve and protect lands, and this is a county requirement, for long-term commercial forestry and long-term commercial agriculture, where all those critical areas and other types of lands, mineral lands. But how the actual names of the zoning districts that are applied locally are a local decision and process.
Conversion, forest conversion is a thing. But
There's a forest land conversion ordinance that DNR implements. It's all about the permits you need to get when you take something from forestry into something else. And there's local permits as well, but I think you're talking about a zoning district you'd have to ask staff about.
Yeah, in Camas locally, there isn't a forest conversion zone or anything like that. The only
Say that
thing,
again?
in Camas, the city of Camas, we don't have any kind of forestry zoning or forestry conversion language. That language does sound very similar to what DNR, the DNR program and conversion of forest lands, which is through
The reason why I asked it was because even before anyone talked about North Shore planning, right across the street, our little park over here that has that little pretty picture of all the ducks and stuff, and you can talk about it, the North Shore is already labeled on that large picture as forest conversion.
And so which park are you?
It's our park, right across the street.
That would be the county park?
I don't know if it's.
Yeah, that's the county park.
The one right here around Lake Park, where the.
So,
Yeah.
So it's already labeled as that, and so I was thinking, like, I looked at what forest conversion meant, basically.
And so the county has,
So that was county.
they have forestry
Yeah.
zoning and different things like that, and that is a county park directly across
So
the
the
street.
county
So
would
that's the
designation on that.
confusion, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, we are at our last speaker, the part you all came to get your certificate that we had open public meetings. We made you wait this long. So without further ado, I'm going to bring Jim up. I'm going to put these at the back and hand out some evaluations, and we'll trade them out at the end. Take it away, Jim. I'll get your presentation right up.
I'm up. Okay, here we go. All right, there we go. Well, Jennifer gave a great presentation, and she said, great mom advice about how they should cooperate and be nice to each other, to planning commission staff. I'm a lawyer, and my advice is, don't get us sued. I brought this to the last time I did this presentation. A lawsuit agrees to $150,000 in payouts for records requests. So I'll get to records, public records in a minute, but my advice, a lot of the public record stuff is handled by staff, but my bottom line is, don't get my clients sued, please. Okay? So we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so now we're going to talk about two different laws that this is really important to understand. Until recently, it was good to know about the Open Public Meetings Act. It was good to know about the Open Public Records Act and Open Public Meetings Act. But now it's a statutory mandate. Within 90 days, you probably all know this, of being appointed or elected, you have to take this training, and every 4 years thereafter, you stay in office. So now it's mandatory, so now there's a lot more people in the room, which is good. But really, I want to talk about these two acts because they were important even before the mandate you take this training. And some of them affect you more than others. When I say affect you more, much of the work regarding running an open public meeting or noting and noticing a public meeting is handled by staff. They send out the notice. Public records, if you're lucky, you've got a city clerk who handles this, or a public records officer, if you're really lucky, who handles this. And so you may not be involved in the nuts and bolts of responding to a public records request. But we're going to get into the details of that later. But it's important that you understand the bigger picture because it does affect you in a couple of regards. So we're going to talk about these two statutes almost simultaneously because they're very similar. We are in a state, probably in a country, where we don't trust the government a lot. And both these statutes came post-Watergate era, where we really didn't trust the government. Or maybe we used to trust the government, and then after Vietnam and Watergate, we really didn't trust the government. So you look at this language, and it's model language between these two statutes, public records and public meetings. The people do not give the public servants the right to decide what is good for them to know, what is not good to know. The people insist on remaining informed so that they may maintain control over the instruments that they have created. And free and open examination of public records is in the public interest, even though such examination may cause inconvenience or embarrassment to public officials or others. So really strong language. These are the purpose statements. And courts will look at this kind of language, interpreting the statute in terms of, yes, this is the legislative history, it's the purpose, it's actual in the statute. And so it's really important to understand that the idea behind both of these is we are going to make both of these aspects of community life or public life very accessible and open to the public. And so we see that both of these were, the open public records applies to all public agencies, state and local. Recently, due to a decision from our state Supreme Court, it now finally applies to the legislature. How about that? Their records are open as well. Doesn't apply to the courts because a lot of that information is confidential. Public records applies to whatever is a public record, which is a writing. The definition of writing is not pieces of words written down on a piece of paper. It's much, much, much broader than that. It includes emails, it includes text messages, so your city better have a way of preserving text messages. It includes a whole host of things, anything, communicated in some sort of, it's metadata, I don't even know how to say it, I'm not sure what it is, talking to the IT department, but it's everything that it goes well beyond words written on a piece of paper, it goes well beyond documents. It's all your email, and it's email that you've got to maintain for a number of years. The state has this whole records retention schedule. And it's important that you understand that as public officials and members of the public who might want to access these public records, that these records, if you ask for a record, then the government has to produce it, and we're going to talk about the mechanics of that. Not too much about the mechanics because it'll be city staff or county staff who do the searching for and the production of the records. But again, I want to show some of the similarities between these things. It applies to all agencies. Again, Public Meetings Act applies to all multi-purpose public agency boards, commissions, governing bodies. Again, doesn't apply to the courts, doesn't apply to the legislature. And meetings of the government, gavel to gavel, have to be open unless authorized by law. And I'll talk about it in a minute. Certain meetings aren't subject to the Open Public Meetings Act. And for the sake of brevity and me, I'm just going to call it the PRA is the Public Records Act, and the Open Public Meetings Act is the OPMA. That's how everyone refers to it. So again, here's a big presumption about public records. Records of an agency are presumed open unless it falls within an exemption. And that sounds kind of obvious and kind of easy. I mean, the idea is we want the public to have access to these records. And so we can get, a lot of times, as the city attorney advising our public records officer or talking to the public who wants a record, a lot of times there's some impatience. Well, I asked for this record, why do I have to wait so long to get the record? And it's usually not that long, but sometimes they're impatient. And we say, well, you have to review it because, yeah, it's a record and it's available to the public unless it falls within an exemption. And here's my little visual aid for tonight. The statute has a number of exemptions in it. If you look at the statute 4256, this is a listing of all the other places in state law that exemptions show up. I mean, they're just pages and pages of them. And it's basically, you don't want to release a record which is not subject to disclosure because the person who's mentioning that record may not like it. And if they don't like it, here's my other example, they're going to sue you. So I got served with this lawsuit yesterday, and I brought it here because I thought it was valuable. And typically, if you've ever been involved in a lawsuit, I'm sorry, but if you have, you've seen the pleadings, John Smith versus Mary Doe. That's the caption, that's the name of the parties. Let me just flip through this. These are the names of the parties. Somewhere in here is my client's name. I think I highlighted. River City Transit, who is run by the city of Longview, so they're my client too. And the reason they're there is you've heard of the Camas decision, and union dues are optional, and Freedom Foundation wants to inform members of unions that maybe they don't have to pay their dues. So they wanted public records from all these agencies who were listed All these are various, every school district in the state's listed as a defendant, every transit agency is listed as a defendant. I think Camas School District, I don't think I saw you guys in here, but anyway, not yet. This is the Third Amendment complaint, keep on adding parties. So basically, they wanted the names, the email addresses, the social security numbers, and date of births of all these union employees so they could contact them and say, hey, you really want to pay your union dues. Well, a lot of these people didn't like that idea, so now there's a big lawsuit over it. So that's the problem with inadvertent disclosure. Somebody's going to not like it. And the problem with social security numbers is the legislature, in its great wisdom, didn't think about exempting that. And so there was a Thurston County Superior Court enjoined it, and so it'll eventually probably go up to our state Supreme Court about whether that is something that is going to be disclosable. Again, I just use this as an illustration. It happened just yesterday. I was going to do this presentation. I was going to talk about the importance of public records and understanding that it takes a while to review these records because sometimes there's an injunction and there's all kinds of things that go on behind the scenes. So anyway, records are exempt unless they fall within are open unless they fall within one of those exemptions. By and large, most of the things people are going to ask for, they're going to get. Hey, I want to see the Planning Commission minutes from 3 months ago. Right, that's not a problem. The types of exemptions you'll see are, for example, let's say your planning department has a list of archaeological sites because you want to make sure that if somebody's going to do a subdivision, they don't disturb an important archaeological site. Well, you don't want every guy with a metal detector to know where that is, right? So things like that. There's a whole host of things. Highly offensive, juveniles, their conviction records, that's an example. You have a lot of things that, you want to protect people's privacy. The social security number, it's probably been stolen already, but anyway. For me, that's private. My date of birth and social security number, I'm really concerned about that. But eventually, maybe the legislature, now that they're subject to the Public Records Act and the Public Meetings Law, maybe they'll be a little bit more concerned. Anyway, so both of these laws are to be liberally construed. PRA by statute, we're told, and the courts will see that. Liberally construed, that means if it's a public record and if it doesn't fall within an exemption, it goes out. And the same thing with open public meetings, liberally construed. What's a meeting? And that's really one of the main topics I want to talk to you about in terms of what's a meeting, right? Jennifer talked about how to have a nice meeting. I'm going to sort of talk about how not to have a meeting in terms of things that you might not think are a meeting are really a meeting, okay? So we understand it's important that the public be able to attend your meetings. The public has the right to see how policy decisions are made in terms of what's the discussion? What are the pros and cons? Right? To have meetings that we give notification of. That's what the Open Public Meetings Act is all about. We notify the public, we allow them to attend, we have the discussion in public. Well, what if you, as a planning commission member, start emailing your other planning commission members and say, hey, there's a hearing coming up next week. I really am not certain about this. What are your thoughts about it? And you've got a quorum of planning commission members exchanging emails about this upcoming hearing and on this matter. That's a meeting, and that's the major caution I wanted to extend you, is that it's not people getting together in the same room, but it is a meeting because action is taking place. And the law defines action in terms of what you can do and what constitutes, a meeting. A meeting is where action takes place. So what's action? And action is defined, as most things are defined, it means a transaction of official business by a governing body, but not limited to receipt of public testimony. That's typically what you think of. Deliberations, discussions, considerations, review, evaluations, and final actions. So anything, if you're exchanging this stuff by email, you're having a meeting, and if you're doing that via email, you're likely violating the Open Public Meetings Act, right? Because those discussions should be held at the regularly scheduled, advertised meeting of the Planning Commission or City Council. So, again, I'm not going to go into the details about how to have a good meeting. I'm talking about don't have a meeting unless it's a noticed meeting, and that's really important. So anyway, again, meetings are open to the public, and it applies to all these various agencies. So if you have a quorum, and you take action, then you're having a meeting, okay? So all meetings have to be open to the public. Now, regular and special meetings, regular meetings are, let's say your city council decides by ordinance they're going to meet the second and fourth Thursday of every month, like Longview does. That's a regular meeting. The public knows you're going to have a meeting. If it's going to be canceled, they notify the public that it's going to be canceled. Special meetings are, let's say the planning commission, there's a snowstorm, they had to reschedule a meeting. So you need to have a special meeting, you're scheduling it on a separate time. You can do that, you're not locked into the first and third Thursday, but you need to notify the public and you need to notify people who have asked for notification of special meetings, and you need to notify the press. So that's a special meeting is something other than a regular meeting. If you have a work session, let's say workshops that the planning commission might have, city councils have workshops all the time, to sort of talk about the policy decisions, give direction to staff. That's a meeting, okay? So the public has a right to attend. They have to notify the public of those meetings. Again, this is important for you to know, but it's going to be staff who sends out the notice, make sure it shows up wherever your ordinances say public notices can be done, whether it's on the website or in a local newspaper. And again, as I say, the act is liberally construed, so don't say, well, that was just four of us, just sort of talking about future direction of the city council. We really didn't take any action. Now, you got a quorum, you're having a discussion about future action and planning policy, that's a meeting. Another thing you have to be cautious about is the perception of whether you're having a meeting. And let's say, and it's common for, planning commission goes till midnight, goes, for a long meeting, or whatever. You're all tired, and you all decide to go out to a bar afterwards, right? And you celebrate, that you got through the 30 pages of code update. And there's 4 of you, or 5 of you in the room. You're not talking about the council business anymore, the planning commission business anymore. But what's the perception if a member of the community sees 5 of you huddled around a table? And I've always said to my city council, and they say, well, as long as we don't talk about city business, aren't we okay? And I'm thinking, 5, 6 different people, what else do they have in common except city business, right? And even if they're just talking about sports, across the room I see 5 city council members sitting together, I'm thinking, they're having a meeting, and it wasn't advertised. Because people pay attention to this stuff. They really do. People know about the public meetings law, and they get really suspicious, and doing that sort of thing sort of diminishes confidence in government if they think that you're meeting outside a regular scheduled meeting. So there is special exceptions to what is considered a meeting. There's called social gatherings. Let's say the chair of your planning commission wants to have a Christmas party, and they invite all the other planning commissioners. Right? It's fine. It's called a social gathering. It's not a public meeting. You have a quorum, but always I advise just to talk about business, right? It's like, again, what else do you have in common? Talk about something else. I don't know. But again, you have to be cautious about that. You have to be cautious about the perception. Typically, if you're going to have a work session, or sometimes council will do like a tour of sites that are being proposed for rezoning, and so they're all going to be on the bus. I say rent a larger bus, make sure there's room for the public on that bus, or a second bus, or something like that, so the public has the right to attend. So, okay, action, as they say, is very broad. It's not just, all in favor of, say, aye. It's public testimony, deliberations, discussion, review, evaluations, as well as final actions. All that falls into the definition of an action. And again, if it's just 4 of you, i.e. a quorum of you, discussing something by email, that's a meeting, and it's a violation. The other way that can be a problem for you is you exchange an email to another planning commissioner or another city council member, and they comment on it, and they forward it on to another council member, and they forward it on to another council member, and before you know it, you've got a quorum of it who have sort of weighed in on this thing that was, at one point in time, just between 2 council members. That's what's called a serial meeting. And then eventually you've got a quorum of council members or planning commissioners weighing in on something. So that's a violation of OPMA as well, because what are you doing? You're talking about something, you're making up your mind, you're discussing the pros and cons, all outside the public venue where the public has no opportunity to say, no, your facts are wrong on that, or let me correct you on that, right? So it all has to be done inside that meeting. So final action, collective, positive, negative, must be taken in the public, even if deliberations were in closed session. And I'll talk about closed session, executive session in just a minute. Secret ballots are never allowed. The public has the right to know. For city council, not planning commission, but city council, they voted for you. They're entitled to know what your vote was. Council member so-and-so voted for against this. I'm angry or I'm happy with them. You have to, raise your hand or say aye or whatever. And those votes will show up in minutes. So I've already mentioned what a regular meeting is. No additional notice is required because it's already the regular meeting. Special meetings are, say, hey, it's an emergency, we need to get together and meet and talk about, funding this road improvement because it just washed out, so we're going to schedule a special meeting, and then you can do that on short notice. But the action, and the important thing to remember in this context as well, on a regular meeting, you put out the agenda, you say what we're going to discuss that night. If a council member at your regular meeting says, hey, here's something else I think we ought to address, we're hearing citizen complaints about X, Y, and Z, can we direct the Public Works Director to do that? All in favor? Aye. Great. It wasn't on the agenda, but it was at a regular meeting. At a special meeting, you cannot take final action on something that wasn't on the agenda, and that's really important. So if another council member at a special meeting has a brilliant idea, you could probably address it and you say, yeah, we ought to really address this at a regular meeting because you can't take action on something not on the agenda at a special meeting. Because again, these are kind of like the public didn't really have much as good an opportunity to attend, and so the agenda there is really important so the public knows exactly what's going to take place there. So action in special meetings is limited to what's on the agenda. Okay, so the agenda is available online, not later than 24 hours in advance. You can put it online. I don't know who's not at the website anymore, but maybe some small communities. Doesn't apply to agencies with fewer than 10 full-time employees. Doesn't prohibit amending the agenda, so that's possible at a regular meeting, and doesn't invalidate otherwise legal actions. Okay, special meetings I mentioned, they're other than regular meetings. You have to give at least 24-hour notice to everybody else on the governing body. You can't say, let's meet but not invite Fred because he's going to vote against this. Give notice to everybody on the city council, everybody on the planning commission, whatever, and then post it on your website. And again, as I said, no final action if it's not on the agenda. Okay, so there is limited exceptions to when the public meetings don't have to be open to the public, and those are executive sessions. I've never come across a situation in decades of practicing municipal law where the planning commission needed to meet in executive session. Executive sessions are taking personnel action, purchase and sale of real estate, national emergencies, and a few other things. Litigation, to discuss litigation strategy with their attorney. That stuff generally, and I've never seen it occur where that had to involve the planning commission. That involves city council all the time, right? We're being sued, here's a settlement offer, should we accept it or reject it? So again, executive sessions, you can exclude the public, but you don't want to basically go into executive session unless you're within one of the statutory bases and talk to your city attorney, confer with them, and say, hey, we need to discuss this. This is something we can do in executive session, and they'll tell you, yeah, whether you can or not. Sometimes it's like, here's an example. We were going to be doing orientation for our new city council members, newly elected, and we're going to talk to them about, we do this Alice training, where an invader comes in, somebody comes to the council meeting, how do you respond and how do you escape? What are the escape routes from the city council chambers? Well, you don't want to do that in public, right? You want to do that one-on-one or in a small group, but could we do that in executive session? No, because it's not listed as one of the things. So I said, just talk them through it one-on-one. You can't do it as a city council as a whole in executive session. So, so as I say, limited circumstances. So personnel matters is listed, litigation, purchase or sale of real property. Again, the city is getting ready to sell real property, and the council can decide, what's the minimum sale price? Well, they can discuss that, they need to discuss that, but you don't want that open to the public. Oh, they'll sell it for as low as $500,000? I was prepared to offer them $600,000, right? So that obviously would hurt the city's interest, so that can be held in executive session. So acquisition or sale of real property for obvious reasons. And then again, this is something your mayor will probably be familiar with, or your city attorney will walk you through this. But before you go into executive session, there's certain things you need to do. You have to say that you're going to an executive session. That's why everybody's going to the back room. It's not to smoke a cigar kind of deal. It's the purpose. It doesn't have to be in detail. We're going to discuss a litigation matter. We're going to discuss pending litigation. We're going to discuss a real estate matter, real estate acquisition, something like that in general terms. And then the length of the time the session is estimated to last, right? Should I stay here sitting out in the audience Or are they going to be back there for 3 hours and I'll go home and get something to eat, right? Or are they going to be just an executive session for half an hour and I'll just wait here, in the council chambers? You have to let them know that. If you go over that time, then you need to have the mayor go back out there and say, oh, we're extending the executive session by 30 minutes. And I'm usually back in executive session with them. I look at my watch. I'll give the mayor like 5 minutes. We said half an hour, it's been 25 minutes. So just keep that in mind. Somebody, city clerk, city manager, or city attorney, somebody needs to be there. I always go into executive session because somebody's got to keep them in the lines. Like, no, you can't talk about that. That's not what this executive session was. I mean, obviously, you get 7, 9 people in there. The conversation sometimes can tend to stray. Boy, can it ever. Sort of the Port of Vancouver was discussing the lease of property for oil. And it was Columbia Riverkeeper, right? Got wind of it somehow, because it was an executive session. I'm not sure how they heard about it. And the statute basically says you can discuss the minimum sale or lease price. Well, they were talking about all kinds of stuff besides that. And the Supreme Court said, no way, minimum sale price, you can't talk about anything else. And it was really confining because there's all sorts of things you're going to want to talk about. What are the factors that affect the minimum sale price? Anyway, it's really strictly construed, so you ought to have your legal counsel back there with you. Again, I'm addressing this to city council members because I've never been in a city where it was needed for the planning commission to go to executive session. Okay, I mentioned before, email communications can constitute a meeting if there's a quorum of them. That's why you always are cautious about reply all emails. Staff is entitled to send news to you, right, information to you. So if your planning official sends something all to all the planning commissioners, or they send it to the city council meeting members, that's fine. Exchange, they're giving you information, that's what staff does all the time, right? But you basically, you absorb that information and then that's it. You don't start a dialogue about the pros and cons of the staff report that the staff just sent to you. So anyway, as I said before, and I've said repeatedly now, that exchange of email can be a violation. So again, mere receipt of it about it from staff or from a member of the public isn't a violation of the OPMA. OPMA is enforced by the courts. They can impose a $500 civil penalty against each member. Let me reinforce that, against each member, not the city of Camas, against you for a violation. So keep that in mind. That always gets my council members' attention. No, it's not the city general fund that's going to pay that. It's going to be you pay it because you violated it. So $500 for the first knowing violation, $1,000 for subsequent action. So it's intended to hurt. Court will award costs and attorney fees to a successful party seeking remedy. That's where the real meter starts to run, the attorney fees. And action taken at an improperly closed meeting can be declared null and void. And that's really, I think, the biggest danger. Okay, $500,000 is going to hurt. But really, as public officials, you should be devoted to making sure that that process is a clean process. As I mentioned before, the applicant might have spent thousands of dollars on engineering fees, thousands of hours or hundreds of hours developing their project. Many people showed up that hearing. If something happens to void that meeting and they have to do it all over again, renotice the meeting, you're wasting staff time, you're wasting the public's time who showed up to that meeting. So try and make sure it's a clean process. And this applies to violating appearance of fairness doctrine as well, or having a meeting that is voided because of OPMA violation because you met in advance to discuss the outcome and then went out there in the public and made the determination. Okay, so open public records, again, I touched on this. It's a very broad definition of what is a record, and really the public ought to define what they want when they request a record. And again, this doesn't matter that much to you because it's going to be staff or somebody looking for these records. But just keep in mind, if you generated an email and you never printed it out, keep in mind that the public has a right to see that email if you're doing it in your official capacity. I think we've probably all heard horror stories about somebody saying something offensive in an email or in a text or something like that, and then it comes out and it's publicized as well. You don't need that. Your city doesn't need that kind of publicity. And so don't think that it was just, a private email between you and somebody else. If you're using city resources to produce that record, it's going to be considered a public record. And as I say, there is a state records retention schedule, but it goes back a ways, and we hold on to these records for years. So retained in any physical form, it's going to be considered a record. And again, a lot of the language in the Public Records Act is archaic. Faxes and microfiches, which still exist, I'm sure, but it is a big problem. Okay, so writing, I already told you, is a very broad definition. Handwriting, typewriting, printing, photostating, photographing. There's been some court cases, what facsimile, is that the same thing as something else? It's like, anyway, so it's a very broad definition. When in doubt, produce the record is the bottom line. Because as I said initially, the statute is broadly in term. So it would be good to have a public records officer because somebody needs to receive these records, and you as a public official should make sure that those records are kept, that come into your possession, because what may happen is if there's let's say a citizen corresponds to you about something which is official city business, that's a public record. You should probably give it to the city clerk or a copy to the city clerk. Some citizen may make a public records request. Then they would obviously, the records officer ought to send out an email, for example, say, hey, we got this public records request for these documents. If any of these are in your possession, please send them to me so we can respond to this public records request. And the danger is, that you don't disclose those records. If you don't disclose the records, then they go to court and say, well, let's say they find out later that there was a record but you didn't produce. There are penalties. There are and the penalties are assessed, depends upon the judge, the court. In some instances, per page, per day, that the record wasn't produced, and they can be substantial. If they hire an attorney, the Public Records Act provides for attorney fees. It is a mini industry for some people making public records requests because of the damage claims. The legislature finally fixed this where prisoners would make public records requests because, oh, I'm going to send this public request to Wapato, right? Little Wapato. And maybe it'll slip through the cracks and I'll file a public records lawsuit. There was a guy by the name of Arthur West who makes a handy living. I'm not sure what he does full time. He's constantly in the court reports of, I think Thurston County just had to pay him some sum of money for records that he requested, and the city didn't produce them because they thought they were exempt, but they weren't. The court said they weren't, and so now they're going back to determine it. You don't want the city to be bleeding money on that because sometimes it can be substantial, and also it doesn't give a good perception to the public, and it looks like you're trying to hide the records. Mechanically, the way it works, and again, this is a staff function. Somebody makes a public records request, the staff has to respond within 5 days, at least acknowledging the receipt of the record, and then giving them a reasonable estimate of when the record will be produced. How long it takes to produce the record is going to depend upon what they're asking for. Sometimes it can be thousands of pages, so it depends. Okay. Anyway, if somebody makes a records request, again, this is sort of more something the staff has to worry about than you do, but they have to request identifiable records. If they're asking for information, constituents write all the time asking for information. That's not a public records request, it has to be for an identifiable record. But we are required as government agencies to provide full assistance. And now that people can, and we're encouraged to provide the records electronically, there used to be a little bit of a disincentive, to make a large records request because they have to pay per page. Well, now you can send it electronically, which is good. You want people to get the information. 99% of the records requests are fairly run-of-the-mill. Can I get a copy of City Council's minutes or a copy of this ordinance? It's the little oddball ones that's like, really? Do we need to produce all our utility records for the last 30 years? He's asked for it. It's identifiable. We have it. It's kind of a big drain on resources. But basically, you have to give them an estimate of how long it's going to take. And now that you can produce it electronically, where's the disincentive? We get a lot of records requests from universities. I'm doing a research study, and I like all this data. And you can see them send it to every city in the state of Washington. It's like, okay, we're happy that you're doing research, but it takes a lot of time for the city clerk to respond to this records request. It is what it is. It's you live with it, but it does take a lot of staff time. So you have to read the request carefully. So make sure you work with your records technician or your city clerk, whoever's collecting records on your behalf, so that they do have the full scope of the records so they can produce them in a timely manner, so the city doesn't doesn't get sued for not producing a record or, some sort of obvious problem there. You can provide them in installments. Again, this is stuff that more or less really doesn't apply to you, except I just wanted to let you know that it is a big problem. There's no privacy exemption in the PRA, so if you're sending something you think is private information to your spouse or a friend and you're using city email, too bad, you shouldn't use your private, you shouldn't use a public email, you should use your private email. If you use a city-issued phone and you're using it for both public and private purposes, if somebody makes a public records request, the city records officer is probably going to go through your phone to make sure that they have all the city public records. So I always advise people, and in many instances in our departments, we have 2 phones. If you want to use a phone, you have your own phone, here's a second phone to use for official city business. And also for text messages, we have to have certain carriers because only certain carriers will be able to recover text messages. So that's important that you have a provider who can do that service for you, because if you get a public records request for text messages on your phone and you can't produce it, I guess you're in trouble. Okay. Again, as I mentioned, you can charge 15 cents per page, but mostly nowadays we provide the records electronically. It's faster. You just send it back to them via email. And I think okay, civil penalties I mentioned, attorney fees, which is real the money are. And okay. Again, I just want to let you know that there are severe penalties. Always talk to your attorney. Okay, withholding public records of information must be authorized by law, so it has to be a specific exemption. I told you there's dozens of exemptions. Facebook posts, this is going to be a big thing too, and I think I'm about out of time. A lot of city council members or planning commissioners have their own Facebook pages. If you are talking about Facebook page, on your Facebook page, your city business, I'd say keep them separate. Keep an official Facebook page for your work as a planning commissioner or city council member. Keep a separate one for your personal stuff. Held that city council members' personal Facebook posts related to city business were not public records. Specifically, when the council member took it upon herself to post generally publicly available information, she was not acting in her official capacity. She was going beyond that, though she probably would have had reduced it. This is the case, I'll just end on this one. It's like, okay, prosecuting attorney for Pierce County. Fairly smart, I don't know the guy, I imagine he's a very, very sharp attorney. Basically, they asked for his phone records, his official phone records, and he pushed against it and pushed against it. Basically, he said, this is on a public phone. He said, they're private and they pertain to public business. I'm not going to share them. 9-0 ruling. That means every single member of the Supreme Court knew he was wrong. I saw this case going up. I'm saying they're going to lose $304,000 outside attorneys in defense costs. That's not what they paid to the other side. That's what they paid to defend him in this position that he was taking. The fines for non-disclosure total $165,000 plus $178,000 in attorney fees. But Lindquist, who was an elected official, said, we won on the principles we stood for. So there's going down to find everything with the ship. So anyway, as I say, talk to your city attorney, take their advice, and don't be stubborn about it because the consequences for being wrong are pretty severe. Thanks.
Would anybody like to start? Or does everybody want to go home? Okay, so we're available for individual questions. Thank you for filling out the evaluations. You can put them on the back. Pick up a certificate. You fill it out. You sign it. Make a copy for yourself, but give it to the staff of your chair, board, or commission. And thank you so much for coming. Thank you to our speakers, to our guest speakers. Thank you to staff and City of Camas for hosting us, especially Robert Long. We hope the course was a useful one and that you'll travel home safely. Thank you.
Actually, I want to thank you all for coming out here too. to, and everybody for coming tonight for this. It really means a lot to us. Very informative. Safe travels to you as well. I know you got a long journey tonight, so thank you.